Think of the most powerful names from the ancient world: Alexander the Great, Julius Caesar, Pharaoh Ramses. Their titles echo through time, synonymous with legendary conquests and vast empires that stretched across the known world. We see their faces on coins, their stories in epic films, their achievements carved into the stone of history itself. But what if that story, the one we all think we know, is missing the most important characters? What if the real genius behind these empires wasn't the ruler on the throne, but the quiet, brilliant mind standing just behind it, hidden in the shadows? For every celebrated emperor, there was an unseen architect. These were the master planners, the logistical wizards, the political strategists whose intellect and vision actually built the foundations of power. While the king received the glory, these individuals were busy solving the impossible problems of statecraft: how to feed an army of thousands on a months-long march, how to administer justice across a continent of diverse cultures, how to design a financial system that could fund an empire. Their work was systemic, creating the invisible machinery that made the ruler's ambition a reality. And yet, their names are largely forgotten. Their contributions faded into the background of history's grand narrative. This anonymity is one of history's greatest puzzles. Why do we remember the figurehead but forget the brain? The answer lies in the very nature of power itself. Ancient rulers had a vested interest in being seen as the sole source of authority, the divine or heroic leader. To share the spotlight with a brilliant advisor might risk undermining that carefully crafted image. Furthermore, the work of these architects was often administrative, diplomatic, or logistical, less glamorous than leading a charge into battle, but far more essential for long-term survival. Their successes were measured in stability, efficiency, and continuity, achievements that don't always make for thrilling epic poems, but are the absolute bedrock of any civilization. This journey we're about to take is dedicated to pulling back that curtain. We are going to unmask these architects of ancient empires, these unsung brains behind the thrones. We will venture from the deserts of Egypt to the forums of Rome, from the palaces of China to the frontiers of Persia, to meet the engineers who designed revolutionary infrastructure, the spy masters who ran intricate intelligence networks, the legal minds who codified laws that shaped millions of lives, and the diplomatic envoys who wove alliances stronger than any army. We will explore the delicate dance they performed, wielding immense influence while carefully avoiding the jealousy of the monarch they served. This exploration is more than just correcting a historical record. It's about understanding how the world actually works. It challenges our romantic notion of the lone genius ruler and reveals a more complex, collaborative truth, that great achievements are almost always the product of many minds, a symphony of talent working in concert. By discovering these hidden figures, we gain a profoundly different perspective on power, legacy, and the nature of historical memory itself. It's a perspective that feels incredibly relevant today, in a world that still often celebrates the solo celebrity while overlooking the essential teams working behind the scenes. So join us as we step into the shadows to meet the true builders of the ancient world. So who exactly were these hidden figures? To truly understand their impact, we need to define the term architect of empire with some precision. This wasn't the person wearing the crown or leading the triumphal procession. Instead, this was the individual possessing a unique combination of intellect, foresight, and sheer administrative grit that made the ruler's ambition feasible in the first place. Think of it as the difference between the visionary who dreams of a magnificent cathedral and the master builder who actually knows how to source the stone, manage the laborers, and ensure the walls won't collapse. The ruler provided the raw power and the overarching goal, but the architect designed the blueprint for turning that goal into a lasting reality. Their work was foundational, creating the systems and structures that enabled an empire to function, expand, and endure long after any single monarch had passed from the scene. We can see this stark contrast in the way history remembers its heroes. The public glory of a Julius Caesar, celebrated in statues and Shakespearean plays, is undeniable. His name is synonymous with the Roman Empire's reach. But what about the officials who managed the empire's finances, ensuring the legions were paid and fed? What about the diplomats who secured alliances with distant tribes, preventing costly wars on multiple fronts? Their contributions, while less cinematic, were just as vital. While Caesar was the face of Roman power, these individuals were its nervous system, its circulatory system, processing information and distributing resources across a vast territory. These master planners operated on a systemic level. They were the economic thinkers who designed taxation systems that could fund endless campaigns. They were the negotiators who could sit down with a rival kingdom and emerge with a treaty that secured a border for a generation. And they were the innovators who tackled what seemed like impossible logistical challenges, such as figuring out how to supply fresh water to a city of 1 million people, or how to move an army of 50,000 men across a desert. Their genius lay not in personal combat prowess, but in solving complex puzzles of organization and human coordination on a scale never before attempted. The infrastructure of power they built, the legal codes, the road networks, the standardized currencies, was what gave an empire its resilience. A charismatic ruler could conquer, but it was the work of these architects that allowed a conquest to be governed, integrated, and transformed from a plundered territory into a productive province. This distinction is the very first step in appreciating the complex, collaborative machinery of ancient statecraft. It moves us away from the simplistic great man theory of history and toward a more nuanced understanding of how civilizations are actually built, piece by piece, system by system, by brilliant minds who are often content to work in the shadows. To truly grasp the monumental impact of these hidden figures, we need to travel back over 4,600 years to the banks of the Nile and the reign of Pharaoh Djoser. It is here we encounter a man whose legacy is so profound it almost seems mythical, Imhotep. He stands as our first clear, documented example of the shadow architect, a figure whose influence was so vast it transcended his mortal life, eventually elevating him to the status of a god. His official titles alone paint a picture of a staggering intellect. He was the chancellor to the pharaoh, the high priest of the sun god Ra, and the chief sculptor and carpenter. But it is for one specific, earth-shattering achievement that he is most remembered. Imhotep was the mastermind behind the step pyramid at Saqqara. Now, to our modern eyes, accustomed to skyscrapers, calling a pyramid revolutionary might not land with the force it should. But you have to understand, before Imhotep, royal tombs in Egypt were simple, low-lying structures made of mud brick known as mastabas. Imhotep's vision was something the world had never seen. He conceived of stacking 6 of these mastabas, each one smaller than the last, to create a colossal stairway reaching towards the heavens. This was not just an artistic flourish, it was a symbolic bridge for the pharaoh's soul to ascend to the gods. But the true genius was not just in the grand idea, but in the revolutionary execution. The step pyramid was the very first time in human history that massive structures were built using large, cut blocks of stone. Imagine the leap in engineering this required, moving from sun-dried mud brick, a material with severe limitations, to durable limestone was a technological earthquake. Imhotep and his teams had to invent entirely new methods for quarrying these enormous stones, transporting them across the river, and then assembling them with a precision that would ensure the structure's stability for millennia. This was not merely building a tomb, it was pioneering an entire new industry of large-scale stone construction, a blueprint that would define Egyptian architecture for the next 3,000 years. Yet, to define Imhotep solely as an architect would be a profound injustice. His mind was a true polymath's workshop. Ancient records and later traditions venerate him as a brilliant physician, whose medical knowledge was so advanced that he was credited with diagnosing and treating over 200 diseases. He was also a renowned sage and poet, his wisdom sought on matters of statecraft, philosophy, and astronomy. This combination of skills is what makes him the perfect archetype of the shadow architect. He wasn't just a specialist, he was a holistic problem solver. His understanding of engineering informed his administrative decisions. His knowledge of the human body perhaps gave him insight into managing the vast body of the state. He applied his intellect to every domain necessary to support and glorify the reign of his pharaoh, working not for personal fame but for the strength and permanence of the kingdom. The ultimate testament to his impact is what happened after his death. Over the centuries, Imhotep's reputation only grew. He was gradually deified, becoming the Egyptian god of medicine and healing, a rare honor for a non-royal mortal. This posthumous deification speaks volumes about how his contemporaries and descendants viewed his contributions. He was not just a skilled servant of the throne, he was seen as a fundamental benefactor to civilization itself. His story provides a powerful template, a pattern we will see echoed again and again. A single, multifaceted mind, operating with the full backing of a ruler, could indeed catalyze an entire cultural and technological epoch, setting in motion advancements that would resonate for ages. Imhotep's deification is a remarkable exception, a testament to an impact so profound it broke through the usual barriers of historical memory. For the vast majority of these brilliant minds, however, the reward for their service was not immortality, but invisibility. This brings us to the core paradox of their existence, what we might call the advisor's dilemma. How does one wield the power to shape empires while deliberately avoiding any of the glory that comes with it? This was not a matter of simple modesty. It was a delicate and often dangerous high-wire act essential for survival. The throne was a seat of immense, often fragile, ego. A ruler's authority was frequently justified by claims of divine favor or unparalleled personal prowess. The presence of an advisor who was clearly more intelligent, more strategic, or more knowledgeable presented a direct threat to that carefully constructed image. An advisor's success, therefore, depended on a subtle art of making the monarch feel like the true author of every good idea, while quietly ensuring that the bad ones were never implemented. They had to be the invisible hand guiding the ship of state, making the ruler look like a master helmsman even in the roughest seas. Consider the fate of Lai Si, the chief advisor to Qin Shi Huang, the first emperor of a unified China. Lai Si was the architect of the legalist system that crushed the warring states and centralized power under the Qin dynasty. He designed the standardization of writing, currency, and measurements policies that literally shaped Chinese civilization for 2 millennia. His influence was absolute, yet Lai Si understood his position with terrifying clarity. He had to navigate a court rife with intrigue and an emperor known for his paranoia and brutality. His every suggestion had to be framed as a humble proposal, his every victory presented as the emperor's own divine wisdom. The moment an advisor's influence became too visible, the moment the courtiers started whispering that it was really he who ruled, the advisor's life was in jeopardy. This precarious balance was a form of psychological warfare waged daily in the audience chambers of every ancient empire. The advisor had to master the art of persuasion without ever appearing to persuade. They learned to plant seeds of thought so skillfully that the ruler would believe the idea had sprouted from their own mind. They managed the bureaucracy, the endless flow of petitions and reports, in such a way that only the options they favored would ever reach the monarch's desk. Their power was the power of filtration, of context, of framing the very questions to which the ruler would then provide the answers. Their success was measured in the stability and expansion of the realm, achievements that, by their very nature, were systemic and anonymous. A successful harvest, a quiet border, a full treasury, these were the triumphs of the shadow architect. They didn't make for stirring ballads or dramatic sculptures. While the emperor would be immortalized leading a charge, the advisor's victory was the supply line that made that charge possible, a victory that left no single dramatic moment to commemorate. This self-effacing nature of their work was a survival mechanism, but it also guaranteed their obscurity. They traded glory for influence, public acclaim for the quiet satisfaction of seeing their designs become the living, breathing reality of an empire. This dance with power, always one step away from a fatal misstep, defined their lives and ultimately sealed their fate in the history books. While the pharaohs and emperors commanded the armies and received the tribute, the true engine of any empire hummed quietly in the background, powered by ink, papyrus, and meticulous record-keeping. Conquest might be achieved with the sword, but it was sustained by the scribe's stylus. This was the realm of administrative systems, the absolute blueprint of power designed by history's most overlooked architects. Imagine trying to govern a territory spanning thousands of miles, encompassing dozens of different languages, cultures, and ancient rivalries. A charismatic leader can inspire fear or loyalty for a time, but without a system to manage the day-to-day realities of empire collecting taxes, raising armies, dispensing justice, chaos would quickly return. The real genius was not in the act of conquering, but in the art of organizing the conquered into a coherent, manageable, and profitable whole. This required a bureaucratic machinery so effective that it could function almost independently of whoever happened to be sitting on the throne at the time. The creators of these systems understood that control was not about constant military presence in every village. It was about creating a framework of rules and responsibilities that made compliance the most logical and beneficial choice for everyone involved. They built the invisible cage of bureaucracy, one that was sturdy enough to hold an empire together yet flexible enough to adapt to local circumstances. A perfect early example of this systemic thinking can be found with Hammurabi, the Babylonian king famous for his law code. But Hammurabi did not personally chisel those 282 laws into the towering diorite stele that survives today. That was the work of teams of scribes and legal advisors, shadow architects who took the king's desire for order and translated it into a comprehensive and uniform system of justice. The code itself was an administrative masterstroke. By inscribing laws concerning everything from property rights and trade to family matters and assault, these officials created a predictable legal environment. A merchant in one city could now make a contract knowing it would be interpreted under the same rules as in a city 100 miles away. This predictability reduced conflict and facilitated commerce, the lifeblood of the empire. The code's famous principle of an eye for an eye was less about brutality and more about standardizing punishments, preventing endless blood feuds by making the state the arbiter of justice. This was administration as a tool of unification, a way to impose a single identity over a diverse collection of city-states. But perhaps the most sophisticated administrative invention of the ancient world was developed by the architects of the sprawling Persian Empire under rulers like Darius the Great. Facing the immense challenge of governing a domain that stretched from the Indus Valley to the Aegean Sea, they devised the satrapy system. A satrapy was essentially a province, each governed by a satrap, or a protector of the kingdom. The brilliance of this system was its layered approach to control. The central authority, the great king, appointed the satrap, often choosing a relative or a trusted noble. This satrap was responsible for collecting tribute, maintaining order, and raising troops for the imperial army. However, to prevent any satrap from becoming too powerful and rebelling, the Persians introduced a system of checks and balances worthy of any modern government. The military commander of the satrapy's garrison reported directly to the king, not to the satrap. Furthermore, a third official, known as the royal secretary, was tasked with monitoring the satrap's activities and sending regular reports back to the capital. This separation of powers, civil, military, and intelligence within each province, was a revolutionary administrative concept. It allowed for a significant degree of local governance, which was essential for managing cultural differences, while ensuring that the ultimate loyalty of every key official was to the central throne. The satrap could handle local issues effectively without needing to wait for orders from a distant capital, yet he was constantly watched and constrained. This system provided the Persian Empire with remarkable stability and resilience for centuries. These administrative blueprints, from Hammurabi's laws to the Persian satrapies, were not glamorous. There were no grand monuments built to celebrate the anonymous official who perfected the tax roll or designed the reporting hierarchy. Yet, these systems were the very essence of imperial power. They turned the fleeting glory of a military victory into the enduring reality of a governed territory. They were the operating system upon which the empire ran, and the shadow architects who coded that system were among the most vital figures in history. Their work ensured that resources flowed to the center, that laws were applied, and that information traveled across vast distances, making the seemingly impossible task of ancient empire management not just possible but efficient. Now consider the sheer scale of the challenge. An ancient army on the march was essentially a mobile city, a colossal consumer of resources. A single Roman legion, numbering around 5,000 men, required a staggering amount of sustenance each day. Historians estimate that just the grain ration for one legion for one day could amount to several tons. But that is just the beginning. You also have to account for the thousands of auxiliary troops, the cavalry and their horses requiring vast quantities of fodder, the pack animals like mules and oxen that carried the supplies themselves, and the camp followers who provided essential services. This moving mass of humanity and animal life could easily number in the tens of thousands. The logistical architect's first task was a mathematical nightmare, calculating the precise amount of food, water, and equipment needed for a campaign that might last months and cover hundreds of miles through unknown or hostile territory. A miscalculation by even a small percentage could mean disaster, starvation, mutiny, or an army too weak to fight. These planners had to possess an almost intuitive understanding of geography. They selected marching routes not only for strategic speed, but for their proximity to reliable water sources and fertile regions where supplies could be foraged or requisitioned. They planned the armies paced down to the mile, knowing exactly where to establish fortified camps each night, often choosing sites with access to rivers for water and natural defenses. The Roman military machine was a masterpiece of this logistical foresight. Its armies did not wander, they advanced along pre-planned routes, and often, supply depots were established in advance along the intended path, stocked by sea or river transport, which was far more efficient than land. This required incredible coordination between the army in the field and a vast support network stretching back to the heart of the empire. The anonymous officials who managed this system were masters of timing and coordination, ensuring that the legions rarely had to stop their advance simply because they had run out of bread. Their work turned a potentially chaotic migration into a predictable, relentless force. This logistical genius was not confined to the battlefield. It was equally vital for the sprawling metropolises that served as imperial capitals. The city of Rome, at its peak, was home to over 1 million inhabitants. Feeding this immense population was a daily administrative miracle, a task as complex as any military campaign. The entire economy of the Mediterranean was, in many ways, bent toward this single purpose. The man primarily credited with solving this puzzle was the first Roman emperor, Augustus, but the system he put in place was designed and operated by a cadre of brilliant administrators. They created the Annona, the state-sponsored grain dole, which was far more than a simple welfare program. It was a highly sophisticated supply chain that stretched across the sea. A fleet of massive grain ships, some capable of carrying over 1,000 tons of cargo, made regular voyages from the breadbaskets of the empire, first Sicily and Sardinia, and later, crucially, Egypt. The capture of Egypt by Augustus was a strategic masterstroke precisely because it gave Rome control over the Nile's incredibly fertile delta, making the city dependent on a supply line thousands of miles long. The logistical architects had to account for everything: the sailing seasons dictated by weather, the threat of pirates, the maintenance of the fleet, the construction of massive granaries like the Horia Galbi in Rome, which could hold enough grain to feed the city for years, and the distribution network within the city itself to get the grain to the registered citizens. This was a continuous, year-round operation that required a permanent bureaucracy of accountants, ship captains, warehouse managers, and distributors. A single season of bad storms disrupting the grain fleet could lead to famine, riots, and a direct threat to the emperor's power. The men who kept this system running smoothly were, in effect, governing the empire's stability from a dusty office, their calculations and schedules more critical to public order than the speeches of any senator. To appreciate the depth of their planning, we can look even further back to the very cradle of civilization in Mesopotamia. Here, the foundational logistical challenge was not moving supplies across distance, but mastering the environment itself. The Fertile Crescent was a land of paradox, incredibly rich soil, but reliant on the unpredictable flooding of the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. The shadow architects here were the hydraulic engineers who designed and maintained the vast networks of canals, dikes, and reservoirs that made agriculture possible on a scale large enough to support the world's first cities. This was not a one-time construction project. It was a perpetual, society-wide effort. Canals silted up, dikes needed constant repair, and water distribution had to be managed fairly between upstream and downstream communities to prevent conflicts. The officials who oversaw this system held one of the most critical positions in the Sumerian, Akkadian, and Babylonian states. They allocated water rights, organized the corvée labor forces needed for maintenance, and planned the expansion of the canal network to open new lands for cultivation. Their understanding of hydrology, surveying, and large-scale labor organization was the bedrock upon which Mesopotamian power was built. Without their silent, continuous work, the surplus of grain that fed the priests, kings, and armies would never have existed. The ability to control water was the ability to create life, and therefore the ultimate form of logistical power. These ancient masters of logistics, whether planning a legion's march or a city's bread supply, understood a fundamental truth that is often overlooked. Power to move and sustain large populations is a form of control as potent as any weapon. It is the power to project influence, to maintain stability, and to turn the abstract idea of an empire into a tangible, functioning reality. Their contributions, though recorded on humble clay tablets and papyrus scrolls rather than carved into triumphal arches, were the unsung victories that made all the celebrated conquests possible. But the legions and the logistical networks we just discussed all had one thing in common. They were incredibly expensive, and empire's ambitions were always bounded by the harsh reality of its treasury. This is where another group of shadow architects entered the picture, the financial masterminds who understood that economics was not just about counting coins, but about building the very engine of power itself. Conquest required gold, and sustaining that conquest required a continuous, reliable flow of wealth from the provinces to the center. These financial architects designed the systems that made this flow possible, transforming plunder into a sustainable economy. Their work was less about brilliant battlefield tactics and more about the meticulous, often ruthless, science of revenue generation. They had to answer fundamental questions. How do you extract wealth from a newly conquered territory without sparking immediate rebellion? How do you create a currency that traders from Spain to Syria will trust? How do you fund a new war when the treasury is still empty from the last one? The solutions they devised through taxation, state-controlled monopolies, and the strategic exploitation of natural resources formed the economic backbone that allowed empires to not just exist, but to thrive for centuries. A primary challenge for any expanding empire was the sheer variety of economic systems it absorbed. Imagine the Mauryan Empire in ancient India, which under rulers like Ashoka unified a vast subcontinent teeming with diverse kingdoms, each with its own local currencies, weights, and measures. A merchant traveling from the Ganges River Valley to the Deccan Plateau would face a nightmare of conversion rates and questionable scales, stifling the long-distance trade that was essential for imperial cohesion and wealth. The anonymous officials in the Mauryan administration recognized this economic friction as a direct threat to stability. Their solution was an act of brilliant standardization. They introduced a uniform system of weights and measures, and perhaps more importantly, they minted standardized silver and copper coins that were accepted across the entire empire. This was a quiet revolution. Suddenly, a trader could conduct business in a distant city with confidence, knowing that the coins he received would hold their value back home. This standardization reduced transaction costs, encouraged commerce, and allowed the state to collect taxes more efficiently, as payments could be made in a recognizable currency rather than a cumbersome mix of goods. By creating a common economic language, these financial architects were weaving the diverse regions of the empire into a single, integrated market. This wasn't just about convenience, it was a powerful tool of political unification, fostering a sense of shared economic destiny that complemented the emperor's political authority. The Roman approach to imperial finance was equally sophisticated, but it relied on a different kind of architect, the equites or the equestrian class. While the senatorial aristocracy looked down on direct involvement in trade and finance, the equestrians embraced it. They became the engine of Rome's economic expansion, operating as a powerful business class that worked in partnership with the state. One of their most critical and controversial roles was in the system of tax farming. The Roman state, especially in its earlier phases, did not have a massive, permanent civil service to collect taxes from its provinces. Instead, it auctioned off the right to collect taxes to private companies led by equestrians. These companies, known as publicani, would pay the Roman treasury an upfront, agreed-upon sum for the taxes of a particular province. Then it was their job to actually go out and collect that amount, plus whatever extra they could manage as their profit. On one hand, this system was highly efficient for the state, providing an immediate cash injection without the administrative burden of collection. It fueled the treasury for new campaigns and building projects. However, it also created a powerful incentive for exploitation. The tax farmers were notorious for squeezing provincial populations dry, as their personal profit was directly tied to how much they could extract beyond the initial bid. This often led to resentment and unrest, but for the Roman state, it was an effective, if brutal, way to monetize its conquests. The Equestrians also managed other state contracts, from supplying the army with grain and equipment to operating mines and building roads. They were, in effect, the private sector partners of the imperial government, their financial ingenuity and risk-taking providing the capital and organizational skill that the state itself lacked. Their innovations in accounting, contract law, and large-scale project management created the economic infrastructure that sustained the Roman war machine and its magnificent cities. Beyond taxation and trade, the most astute financial architects understood the power of controlling Chinese letter resources. Many empires were built not on a diverse economy, but on the strategic monopoly of a single, incredibly valuable commodity. Think of the vast silver mines of Laurion in ancient Athens, which funded the construction of the navy that defeated the Persian invasion and created the Athenian Empire. The officials who managed these mines were not just foremen. They were economic strategists who understood that controlling the supply of silver meant controlling the ability to mint coins, pay soldiers, and influence trade across the Aegean. Similarly, the Ptolemaic dynasty in Egypt built its legendary wealth not on conquest alone, but on its absolute monopoly over papyrus production and, most importantly, the grain grown in the Nile Valley. By controlling the entire supply chain of grain from the farmers who grew it, to the granaries that stored it, to the ships that exported it, the Ptolemies could manipulate Mediterranean grain prices and use food as a diplomatic weapon. The financial officials who designed this state-controlled system created a steady, enormous revenue stream that allowed the Ptolemies to maintain a lavish court, a powerful military, and the great library of Alexandria. Their genius lay in seeing the economic potential in a natural resource and then constructing a bureaucratic apparatus to harness that potential completely for the state. This kind of resource-based economics required long-term planning and a deep understanding of production, distribution, and market forces skills that were every bit as vital as any military campaign. The silent work of these accountants, mint masters, and resource managers created the financial fuel that powered everything else. Without the economic engines they designed, the dreams of conquerors would have remained just that, dreams, bankrupted by the immense cost of turning ambition into reality. Of course, the control of grain shipments and silver mines provided the physical sustenance for an empire, but there is another, equally vital resource that these ancient states needed to manage: the human mind itself. Beyond the swords and the granaries, the most enduring power was the power to shape what people believed, to define reality for millions of subjects. This was the domain of a different kind of shadow architect, the master of propaganda and ideology. While the ruler might issue the command, it was the scribes, the poets, the philosophers, and the scholars who crafted the compelling stories that turned raw power into legitimate authority. Theirs was the subtle art of constructing a narrative so powerful that it made the empire seem not just strong but right, inevitable, and even divinely ordained. They were the intellectual weaponsmiths, forging the very ideas that bound societies together. We can see this process with brilliant clarity in the foundation of the Han Dynasty in China. After the brutal, short-lived Qin dynasty collapsed into chaos, the new Han rulers faced a monumental task: how to justify their rule and prevent a similar rebellion. The answer did not come from the emperor alone, but from a school of scholars, most notably the thinker Dong Zhongshu. These intellectual architects took existing concepts of cosmology and philosophy and refined them into the doctrine of the mandate of heaven. This was a propaganda masterstroke. It proposed that the emperor ruled because he possessed virtue, order, and that this virtue earned him the blessing of heaven itself. But the truly ingenious part was the condition attached. The mandate was not permanent. If the ruler became corrupt, unjust, or ineffective, he would lose this virtue, and heaven would send signs, natural disasters like floods, famines, or earthquakes as a warning. If he did not reform, the mandate would pass to a new, more worthy ruler, and rebellion was not just permissible, it was heaven's will. This idea served the throne magnificently. It legitimized the Han's own rise to power by framing the qin as having lost the mandate through their cruelty, but it also created a powerful tool for social control, encouraging emperors to at least appear benevolent and effective, lest their subjects see a drought as a divine sign of their failure. The scholars who developed this concept provided the intellectual framework that stabilized Chinese imperial rule for 2,000 years. They gave the empire a soul and a moral justification, making obedience a philosophical and spiritual duty, not just a practical necessity born of fear. On the other side of the ancient world, the Assyrian Empire took a decidedly less philosophical but equally effective approach to controlling the narrative. The Assyrian kings were masters of psychological warfare, and their chief propagandists were the court historians and artists who covered the walls of their vast palaces, like that of Ashurnasirpal II at Nimrud, with breathtakingly detailed reliefs. These were not objective historical records. They were carefully crafted tools of terror and triumph. The carvings depict the king as a giant, muscular figure, often shown calmly and ritualistically hunting lions, a symbol of his power over chaos. In battle scenes, the Assyrian armies are portrayed as an unstoppable, disciplined force, but the most potent propaganda lies in the gruesome depictions of their enemies' fates, cities burning, prisoners being impaled, and defeated kings being led with hooks in their noses. The purpose of these images was twofold. For foreign ambassadors visiting the palace, they served as a stark warning of the consequences of rebellion. But for the Assyrian elite and the court itself, they reinforced a narrative of invincibility and divine favor from their god, Ashur. The king was not just a political leader, he was the chief priest and the representative of the god on earth, and his victories were the god's victories. The scribes who composed the cuneiform inscriptions that accompanied these reliefs used grandiose, standardized language, repeating phrases like, "I swept over them like a hurricane," to create a brand of relentless imperial power. These court historians were the ancient equivalent of a modern state media department, ensuring that only one version of events, the king's glorious version, would echo through the halls of power and, they hoped, down through the ages. This manipulation of narrative extended beyond justifying wars and consolidating power. It was also essential for integrating conquered peoples. When Alexander the Great began his conquest of the Persian Empire, he faced the challenge of ruling over a population that saw him as a foreign invader. His advisors, like the historian Callisthenes, understood that military victory was only half the battle. To legitimize his rule over Egypt, Alexander and his propagandists orchestrated a brilliant political theater. He made a dangerous journey to the remote oracle of Siwa in the Libyan desert. Upon his return, the story was spread that the priests there had greeted him as the son of the god Ammon, effectively recognizing him as the rightful pharaoh. This was not a spontaneous religious event. It was a calculated move, likely suggested by his advisors who understood the power of Egyptian religious tradition. By grafting himself onto the existing divine mythology of the land, Alexander transformed his image from conqueror to legitimate ruler in the eyes of his new Egyptian subjects. His intellectual architects used the local belief system as a tool for assimilation, making his foreign rule more palatable and stable. This strategy of syncretism, blending the conqueror's identity with the conquered's culture, was a sophisticated form of propaganda that required deep cultural insight, a skill possessed by the most astute advisors. The work of these narrative architects was perhaps the most subtle form of power wielded in the ancient world. They operated not with edicts and taxes, but with stories, symbols, and ideologies. A poet like Virgil, commissioned by Augustus's advisor Maximus to write the Aeneid, was engaged in a grand project of political myth-making. His epic poem linked the founding of Rome directly to the heroic Trojans and the gods themselves, providing a glorious and divine pedigree for Augustus's new regime. These intellectual efforts created a shared identity, a common story that citizens could believe in, which was far more effective for maintaining long-term stability than fear alone. By controlling the past, they sought to control the present and secure the future. They built empires not of stone but of ideas, and in doing so, they demonstrated that the most resilient throne is one that rests in the minds of the people. This seamless blending of the earthly and the divine meant that no ruler could afford to ignore the spiritual dimension of their power. To command armies was one thing, but to command the favor of the gods was the true source of legitimacy in the eyes of the people. This is where the religious strategists, the high priests and oracle interpreters, became indispensable architects of the state. Their authority did not come from legions, but from their perceived ability to communicate with the divine realm, to read the signs of the gods, and to perform the rituals that kept the cosmos in balance. A king might be powerful, but if the gods were angry, the rains would fail, the crops would wither, and the people would lose faith. The religious advisor was the essential intermediary who could calm those divine tempers and ensure the continued prosperity of the kingdom. Their influence was profound because it tapped into the deepest fears and hopes of every citizen, from the lowest farmer to the monarch on the throne. Consider the immense political power held by the Pontifex Maximus, the chief high priest of ancient Rome. This was not a purely ceremonial role for a retired senator to enjoy in his twilight years. The Pontifex Maximus was the head of the College of Pontiffs, the most important priesthood in the Roman state religion. His duties were vast and directly impacted the functioning of the empire. He and his college were the guardians of the sacred calendar, a responsibility that sounds mundane but was in fact a tool of immense political control. They decided which days were favorable or fast for public business like holding elections or starting a war, and which days were unfavorable or nefas. A general eager for glory might be forced to delay a campaign for weeks because the pontiffs declared the omens inauspicious. This control over time itself gave them a veto power over the ambitions of the most powerful men in Rome. Furthermore, the pontiffs were the experts in interpreting the complex rituals and laws governing the state's relationship with the gods. If a ritual was performed incorrectly, it was believed the entire city could be placed in spiritual jeopardy, a condition known as procuratio, which required yet more rituals to fix. This created a system where politicians were utterly dependent on the priestly class for guidance, ensuring their continued relevance and authority in the highest circles of power. The influence of these religious architects, however, extended far beyond the spiritual and into the very concrete world of economics. Across the ancient world, temples were not just houses of worship, they were often the largest banks and economic centers in the land. In Mesopotamia, the temples of gods like Marduk in Babylon functioned as massive corporate entities. They owned vast tracts of farmland, herds of livestock, and workshops producing everything from textiles to beer. The high priest and his administrative staff managed this immense wealth, making loans to merchants, storing surplus grain in times of plenty, and distributing it in times of famine. This economic power gave the temple a central role in the daily life of the empire, making the chief priest a figure whose influence rivaled that of the king's own treasury officials. His decisions on lending, investment, and charity could stimulate trade or alleviate suffering, making him a crucial pillar of social and economic stability. To control the temple was to control a significant portion of the nation's wealth, a fact not lost on ambitious rulers who often sought to appoint loyal relatives to these powerful religious posts. This relationship between king and priest was a delicate dance of mutual dependence. The ruler provided protection and patronage to the temple, while the priesthood provided the divine sanction that legitimized the ruler's authority. We see this clearly in the concept of divine kingship, which was expertly managed by religious strategists. In Egypt, the pharaoh was considered a god incarnate, but it was the priesthood of Ammon at Thebes that acted as the caretakers and interpreters of this divinity. During the New Kingdom, the high priests of Ammon accumulated so much land, wealth, and influence that they effectively became a rival power base to the pharaoh himself. At one point, the high priest Herihor even took on royal titles, ruling Upper Egypt simultaneously as both high priest and king, demonstrating how spiritual authority could translate directly into temporal rule. This was the ultimate expression of the priest as a shadow architect, not just an advisor, but a potential successor. Similarly, in the Byzantine Empire, the Patriarch of Constantinople held tremendous sway. While the emperor was the supreme ruler, he needed the Patriarch's blessing for his policies to be accepted by the deeply religious population. A conflict between emperor and patriarch could lead to public riots and instability, as both figures jockeyed for control over the souls and minds of the people. The most successful rulers were those who knew how to collaborate with these religious power brokers, understanding that their blessing was not a mere formality but a necessary component of stable governance. The genius of these religious strategists lay in their ability to navigate this complex intersection of faith and power, using their unique position to shape policy, manage vast resources, and ultimately help build empires that were seen as divinely ordained. While the roar of the legions and the charge of war elephants capture our imagination, the true architects of victory were often far from the clamor of the front lines. They were the strategists in the shadows, the cerebral masterminds for whom the battlefield was a vast chessboard and armies were the pieces to be maneuvered with cold, calculating precision. These individuals understood that a war is won long before the first arrow is loosed, through meticulous planning, deep psychological insight, and an almost supernatural grasp of logistics. Their weapon was not the sword but the map. Their triumph was not a heroic duel, but an enemy army surrendering without a fight because it had been outthought at every turn. The general who led the charge might be celebrated, but it was the anonymous advisor in the command tent who had often devised the entire campaign, turning what seemed like a chaotic melee into a foregone conclusion. We can see this principle in one of history's most audacious military maneuvers, Hannibal's crossing of the Alps to invade Italy during the Second Punic War. While Hannibal's name is legendary, the success of that incredible journey speaks to the work of unseen specialists. Hannibal himself was a brilliant leader, but he was not familiar with the treacherous, snow-clad passes of the Alps. The operation's success depended entirely on the knowledge of local guides and the meticulous planning of his staff officers, whose names are lost to history. These were the shadow architects who, for weeks or even months in advance, would have been gathering intelligence. They sought out tribes willing to provide safe passage. They identified the narrowest defiles where an army could be ambushed, and they calculated the exact pace needed to cross the mountains before the worst of the winter snows trapped them. They solved the impossible logistical puzzle of moving 37,000 men, thousands of horses, and 37 war elephants across some of the most rugged terrain in Europe. Every landslide cleared, every precarious path widened, every negotiation with a hostile chieftain was a victory for these planners. The actual crossing was merely the execution of a plan they had already perfected. The battlefield victories that followed, like the annihilation of the Roman legions at Cannae, were made possible because these strategists had delivered Hannibal's army, against all odds, directly to the heart of Roman power, achieving total strategic surprise. Perhaps the ultimate testament to the power of the military advisor is that their influence could transcend their own lifetime, their wisdom captured in texts that would guide generals for millennia. The most famous example is the Chinese strategist Sun Tzu and his timeless treatise, The Art of War. While historians debate the precise details of his life, the book itself is a crystallized version of advisory genius. Sun Tzu codified the principles that every great shadow strategist understood instinctively. His core philosophy was that the supreme art of war is to subdue the enemy without fighting. This is the essence of the advisor's cerebral approach. He emphasized deception above all else. Appear weak when you are strong, and strong when you are weak. He taught the critical importance of knowing both yourself and your enemy, a task that fell to intelligence officers and scouts who provided the commander with a clear picture of the opposition's morale, supply situation, and leadership. Sun Tzu's work is a masterclass in psychological warfare, stressing the need to break the enemy's will before engaging their army. He detailed the fatal importance of terrain, advising on how to use every hill, forest, and river to your advantage. And most critically for the shadow architect, he understood the logistics of war better than anyone, stating plainly that the line between victory and defeat lies in the supply lines. A general who rushes ahead without securing his provisions is working for the enemy. The art of war is not a manual for heroic combat. It is a guide for systemic thinking, for seeing the entire conflict as a complex system that can be manipulated and controlled. It is the definitive proof that the greatest military mind is not necessarily the one who leads the charge, but the one who understands the deeper patterns of conflict. This division of labor between the charismatic leader and the analytical planner was a feature of many successful military machines. The Mongol Empire under Genghis Khan conquered the largest contiguous land empire in history, not just through the ferocity of its horsemen, but through a sophisticated general staff system that operated with chilling efficiency. Genghis Khan was a brilliant organizer who surrounded himself with a council of trusted advisors, and he integrated officers from conquered tribes who brought specialized knowledge. Before any campaign, the Mongols would send out scouts and spies, sometimes traveling as merchants or monks, for years in advance. These intelligence agents mapped the entire region, noted political divisions and rivalries that could be exploited, and reported on the strength and disposition of enemy forces. This information was synthesized by strategists far from the front, who planned the invasion routes down to the last detail. The Mongol armies moved with a coordination that seemed supernatural to their enemies because their movements were dictated by a grand strategic plan. They used feigned retreats to draw opponents into traps, a tactic requiring impeccable timing and communication between separate army units, all directed by a central command. The battlefield commander executed the plan, but the victory was engineered by the unseen architects who had gathered the intelligence and designed the strategy. Theirs was a victory of information and organization, proving that a well-planned campaign by a general staff could achieve more than the isolated brilliance of any single warrior. The true art of war, as practiced by these shadowy figures, was the art of making victory inevitable before a single soldier ever stepped onto the field. While the strategist planned the campaigns and the spymaster gathered secrets, the most enduring testament to imperial power was literally set in stone, concrete, and brick. Across the landscape of every great empire, we find the fingerprints of a different kind of architect, the engineer. Their legacy is the vast skeleton of infrastructure, the roads, aqueducts, walls, and ports that were far more than mere public works. These were the arteries and sinews of control, physical manifestations of an empire's reach and ambition. We marvel at their scale and durability, but we rarely stop to ask the fundamental question: who were the minds that conceived of these monumental projects? The answer leads us to the most practical of all the shadow architects, the men who turned abstract imperial authority into an undeniable, tangible reality for every citizen, from the legionary on the frontier to the merchant in the capital. Consider the famous Roman road. To a casual observer, it might seem like a simple, if well-built path, but to the empire it was a revolutionary tool of governance. The genius of the Roman road lay not in any single technological breakthrough, but in a system of engineering so effective it became a template for 2,000 years. Before the legions even arrived, teams of surveyors, the agrimensors, would march ahead. Their job was to chart the straightest possible course across often treacherous terrain, using simple but ingenious tools like the groma for aligning straight lines and the chorobates, a precise leveling instrument. They weren't just finding a path, they were imposing a geometric order upon the wilderness, a straight line of Roman rationality cutting through the chaotic natural world. The construction that followed was a masterpiece of layered engineering. A typical road was a multi-layered sandwich of materials. It began with a deep trench, which was then filled with a foundation of large stones. On top of this, successive layers of smaller stones, gravel, sand, and finally, tightly fitted paving stones created a surface that was durable, well-drained, and most importantly, usable in all weather conditions. The subtle crowning of the road surface ensured rainwater would run off into drainage ditches on either side, preventing the mud that would immobilize other armies. This network of roads, eventually spanning over 250,000 miles, was the empire's central nervous system. It allowed legions to march from the Rhine to Rome in weeks, not months. It enabled the imperial post, the cursus publicus, to carry messages and officials at speeds that wouldn't be surpassed until the 19th century. For a local farmer, the road was a constant physical reminder of Roman power. It brought Roman goods, Roman taxes, and Roman laws directly to his doorstep. The road was control made literal. It was the path the empire traveled to enter and organize your life. This engineering prowess extended vertically as well as horizontally. To supply its great cities, especially Rome itself, the empire had to solve the problem of water on an unprecedented scale. The solution was the aqueduct, another testament to the hydraulic engineers who mastered the force of gravity. The challenge was immense: to transport millions of gallons of fresh water daily from mountain springs dozens of miles away, across valleys and uneven plains, and deliver it to the city's fountains, baths, and private homes. The Roman aqueduct was not a simple above-ground arcade. That was only the most visible, dramatic section where the water channel had to cross a depression. For most of its length, the aqueduct was a carefully graded underground channel, hewn through rock or built as a covered trench, maintaining a steady, gentle slope, often a drop of just a few inches per mile, to keep the water flowing smoothly. The precision required for this over such long distances is staggering. The engineers who designed them, men like Sextus Julius Frontinus, who wrote a detailed book on Rome's water supply, combined a theoretical understanding of hydraulics with immense practical skill. They built settling tanks to purify the water, distribution tanks within the city to regulate flow, and sophisticated lead or ceramic pipes to direct water to its final destination. The public baths or thermae that these aqueducts supplied were not merely about hygiene. They were grand social centers available to all citizens that promoted a common Roman identity and demonstrated the state's commitment to the welfare of its people. The constant flow of clean water was a powerful symbol of Roman civilization itself, orderly, life-sustaining, and flowing inexorably from the heart of the empire to its subjects. Half a world away, in the arid heart of the Persian Empire, a different set of engineers confronted an equally daunting challenge: how to create life in the desert. Their solution, the Qanat system, was a breathtaking feat of underground hydraulic engineering that allowed civilization to flourish in some of the most inhospitable climates on Earth. A Qanat is essentially a gently sloping underground tunnel that taps into a water table at the base of a mountain and channels it by gravity to the surface many miles away, where it can irrigate fields and supply settlements. The construction of a single Qanat was a monumental community effort requiring a deep understanding of geology and surveying. Teams of workers would first dig a vertical mother well deep into the water-bearing layer. Then, beginning at the point where the water was needed, they would tunnel back toward the mother well, all while maintaining the precise, gentle slope necessary for the water to flow without eroding the tunnel. At regular intervals, they would dig vertical access shafts to the surface, which served to provide air for the diggers, remove excavated material, and allow for maintenance of the tunnel for centuries to come. From the air, a Qanat system looks like a line of craters marching from the foothills to the oasis. The Qanat was a technology of profound stability. Because the water source was underground, it was protected from evaporation, making it a reliable source even during droughts. This allowed for the establishment of permanent agricultural settlements and thriving cities like Persepolis in regions that would otherwise be barren. The Persian imperial administration actively promoted the construction of Qanats, understanding that this infrastructure was the key to unlocking the economic potential of their territory. The engineers who designed and maintained these systems were not just builders, they were creators of life, enabling the Persian Empire to project power and sustain populations across vast dry lands. Their work was a quiet, sustained miracle, a hidden river flowing beneath the sand, binding the empire together not with roads of stone but with veins of water. Ultimately, these grand projects served a dual purpose. Yes, they were utilitarian marvels that solved critical problems of transportation, supply, and settlement. But they were also, unmistakably, acts of propaganda in stone and water. A Roman citizen living in distant Britain, walking on a road that was clearly built to a standard identical to those in Italy, received a powerful message: you are part of a vast, organized, and permanent system. An aqueduct soaring over a valley was not just a water delivery system, it was a statement of the empire's ability to define nature itself. A Persian Qanat turning the desert green was a demonstration of the king's power to bring order and fertility to chaos. This infrastructure was the physical embodiment of the imperial promise: security, stability, and the benefits of civilization in exchange for loyalty and taxes. The engineers who designed these systems were, therefore, among the most important ideological architects of the ancient world. They built the stage upon which the drama of empire played out, creating an environment so pervasive and functional that resistance seemed not just dangerous but irrational. Their names may be lost, but their handiwork remains, a silent testament to the power of practical genius in shaping the course of human history. While the engineers' roads and aqueducts physically bound an empire together, another, more subtle architecture was being woven in the quiet chambers of palaces and through the journeys of envoys crossing dangerous frontiers. For all the glory of military conquest, empires were just as often expanded and secured through the art of diplomacy. This was the world of the diplomat, the ambassador, the marriage negotiator, the architects who built not with stone but with words, promises, and strategic relationships. Their work was conducted in the shadows, far from the cheering crowds that greeted returning legions. Yet a successfully negotiated alliance could secure a border for a generation, achieving what 10 military victories might not. Their greatest triumphs were invisible: the wars that never started, the rebellions that were peacefully quelled, the slow, steady integration of a rival power into a sphere of influence without a single life being lost. This delicate art required a unique set of skills. A diplomat had to be a master of languages, a student of foreign cultures, and a psychologist capable of reading the ambitions and fears of a rival king. Above all, they needed a cold, pragmatic understanding of realpolitik, the recognition that state interests, not friendship or morality, were the ultimate drivers of international relations. Their mission was to find the overlapping interests between two powers and frame them as a common cause. A powerful and ancient example of this diplomatic web-building comes from the Hittite Empire in Anatolia, a major power that constantly jockeyed for influence with rivals like New Kingdom Egypt. The Hittites mastered the use of diplomatic marriage as a tool of statecraft. These were not simple romantic unions. They were highly calculated political transactions negotiated by teams of advisors and envoys. The most famous instance is the peace treaty and subsequent marriage alliance between the Hittite king Hattusili III and the Egyptian pharaoh Ramses II, following the epic but inconclusive Battle of Kadesh. After years of costly warfare, both empires realized that a stalemate was draining their resources. Diplomats from both sides engaged in protracted negotiations, eventually producing one of the world's first surviving international peace treaties, a clay tablet version of which resides in the United Nations today. But the treaty was just the foundation. To cement it, the Hittite and Egyptian courts arranged for a Hittite princess to travel to Egypt to become a wife of Ramses. The logistics of this journey were a diplomatic operation in itself, requiring guarantees of safe passage and elaborate ceremonies to honor both kingdoms. For the Hittites, this marriage created a blood tie to the powerful Egyptian throne, transforming a bitter enemy into a royal in-law. It secured their southern border, allowing them to focus on other threats. For Egypt, it brought a prestigious alliance and a lasting peace. The diplomats who brokered this arrangement understood that a family bond could be a stronger fortress than any wall, weaving a thread of personal connection into the fabric of geopolitical strategy. The success of a diplomat, however, hinged on more than just proposing a clever deal. It depended on a profound cultural sensitivity that is often overlooked in stories of ancient brute force. An ambassador from Rome sent to the court of the Parthian Empire, for instance, had to be acutely aware of the intricate protocols of the Persian court. The manner of greeting, the level of prostration expected before the King of Kings, the acceptance of gifts, every gesture was laden with meaning. A misstep could be interpreted as a grave insult, derailing months of negotiation and potentially sparking a conflict. These envoys were the empire's cultural translators. They had to understand the religious beliefs, social hierarchies, and historical grievances of the people they were engaging with. When a Chinese envoy from the Han Dynasty traveled to the nomadic Xiongnu Confederation, he had to adapt to a completely different way of life. He had to sit in a felt tent, partake in a diet of horse meat and dairy, and negotiate with leaders whose concept of power and loyalty was built around tribal bonds and martial prowess, not Confucian bureaucracy. The diplomat's report back to the emperor would not just be about what was said, but about the mood of the court, the stability of the leadership, and the underlying motivations of their rivals. This intelligence was priceless. It allowed the home court to craft offers that would be genuinely appealing, to identify potential weaknesses, and to avoid actions that would be unnecessarily provocative. The diplomat was the empire's eyes, ears, and voice in a foreign land, and their nuanced understanding of human nature was their most vital asset. Perhaps the most telling measure of a diplomat's value was the sheer trust and autonomy they were granted. In an age without instant communication, an ambassador sent on a mission to a distant land was truly on his own. A message sent from Rome to a client kingdom in the Middle East could take weeks or even months to receive a reply. Therefore, the envoy had to be empowered to make critical decisions on the spot, based on his assessment of the evolving situation. He carried the authority of the emperor or senate, and his word, once given, was binding. This required individuals of exceptional judgment and integrity. A famous example from the Roman Republic before the imperial period illustrates this point. When the Roman senator Gaius Popilius Laenas was sent to confront the Seleucid king Antiochus IV, who was threatening to invade Egypt, he encountered the king's army already on the march. Instead of requesting a meeting, Laenas boldly walked directly up to the king, handed him the Roman Senate's ultimatum, and drew a circle in the sand around Antiochus with his staff. He then demanded that the king give his answer before stepping out of the circle. This breathtaking act of diplomatic audacity, backed by the looming threat of Roman power, worked. Antiochus, caught off guard and weighing the consequences, agreed to withdraw. Laenas's success was not the result of detailed instructions from Rome. It was the product of his own courage, understanding of psychology, and the authority vested in him. He knew that hesitation would be seen as weakness, and his decisive action averted a major war. This incident shows that the art of diplomacy was not passive. In the hands of a skilled practitioner, it could be as potent and active a tool of empire as any legion. But an empire bound by roads and diplomacy would quickly unravel without a single, unifying force governing the lives of every person within its borders. This force was the law. While a king's decree might settle a single dispute, it was the creation of a comprehensive, standardized legal system that truly transformed a collection of conquered territories into a cohesive state. This monumental task fell to the legal architects, the jurists and scholars who undertook the painstaking work of codification. Their mission was to take a tangled web of ancient tribal customs, regional traditions, and contradictory royal edicts, and weave them into a single, coherent body of law that could be understood, applied, and enforced from the capital city to the farthest frontier. This was not merely an academic exercise. It was an act of intellectual conquest as profound as any military campaign, imposing a new kind of order that reached into the homes, businesses, and family lives of millions. We often think of ancient law as being harsh and simplistic, epitomized by the stark principle of an eye for an eye from Hammurabi's code. But to focus solely on the punishments is to miss the true revolutionary nature of these early legal systems. The very act of writing laws down and making them public was a transformative shift in power. Before codification, justice was often arbitrary, administered by local chieftains or elders based on oral tradition and their own whim. This created a system ripe for abuse and inconsistency. A legal code changed everything. It established the principle that the law was a public institution, not a private secret. It meant that a farmer accused of a crime could, in theory, know what the consequences would be. It created predictability. A merchant drafting a contract for a shipment of goods traveling to another province could do so with confidence, knowing that the rules governing that contract were the same at both ends of the journey. This predictability was the bedrock of economic growth and social stability. It reduced the appeal of violent vendettas by making the state the official arbiter of disputes. The law code was the ultimate tool for standardization, replacing a cacophony of local practices with a single, imperial voice of authority. The pinnacle of this legal architecture in the ancient world was undoubtedly the Corpus Juris Civilis, or the body of civil law, commissioned by the Byzantine Emperor Justinian in the 6th century. By Justinian's time, the Roman Empire was ancient, and its legal system was a chaotic mess. Over 1,000 years of legislation, decrees from emperors, opinions from jurists, decisions from magistrates had piled up into an immense, disorganized, and often contradictory mountain of legal texts. A lawyer couldn't possibly know all the laws, and judges could cherry-pick precedents to support almost any ruling. Justinian, a ruler obsessed with restoring the glory of Rome, saw this legal chaos as a fundamental weakness. His solution was to appoint a commission of the empire's finest legal minds, led by the brilliant jurist Tribonian, to undertake a task of staggering ambition: to read, condense, clarify, and systematize the entire 1,000-year history of Roman law into a single, coherent set of books. The result of their labor was nothing short of a masterpiece. The Corpus Juris Civilis was organized into 4 parts. The Codex was a collection of all still valid imperial laws, purged of contradictions. The Digesta, or Pandex, was the most ambitious part, a massive compilation of excerpts from the writings of Rome's greatest jurists, distilling centuries of legal wisdom and precedent into a usable format. The Institutions was a textbook for law students, providing a systematic introduction to legal principles. Finally, the Noveli contained new laws passed by Justinian himself. The intellectual achievement here is hard to overstate. Tribonian and his team weren't just scribes, they were editors, philosophers, and system architects on a grand scale. They had to make judgment calls on which older laws were obsolete, how to reconcile conflicting opinions from respected jurists, and how to structure this vast body of knowledge logically. They created a legal system that was rational, comprehensive, and surprisingly sophisticated, covering everything from contracts and property rights to inheritance and criminal procedure. Its influence did not end with the fall of the Western Roman Empire. It was rediscovered in medieval Europe and became the foundation of the civil law systems that govern most of continental Europe and Latin America to this day. The work of these Byzantine jurists, laboring in libraries while generals fought on the frontiers, ultimately shaped the legal consciousness of the Western world for a millennium. The power of these legal codes extended far beyond the courtroom. They were powerful tools for social engineering, deliberately designed to reinforce the empire's preferred social hierarchy. The Law of the 12 Tables in early Rome, for instance, contained a stark prohibition on marriage between patricians, the aristocratic class, and plebeians, the common people. This wasn't just a social observation. It was a legal mechanism to maintain the power and purity of the ruling elite. Similarly, Roman law meticulously defined the absolute power of the paterfamilias, the male head of the household, over his wife, children, and slaves. This made the family unit a microcosm of the state itself, with the emperor as the ultimate paterfamilias. By legally enshrining these hierarchies, the state co-opted the authority of every father to help maintain overall social control. The law was also a key instrument of assimilation. When Rome granted citizenship to inhabitants of its provinces, it came with the obligation to live under Roman law. This was a powerful incentive for local elites to adopt Roman customs, language, and identity, as mastering the legal system was the key to political and economic advancement. The legal architect, therefore, was not just a drafter of rules. They were a designer of the very social fabric of the empire, weaving threads of authority, privilege, and identity into a stable and manageable whole. Their work demonstrated that the most subtle and effective form of control is not the sword of the soldier, but the pen of the jurist, creating a framework so pervasive that citizens would ultimately govern themselves according to the empire's blueprint. While the legal architect built a framework of public order, another, far more secretive operative worked in the absolute darkness, safeguarding the state from threats that never appeared in any public record. For every empire, the most dangerous challenges were often the ones it never saw coming: the whispered conspiracy within the palace walls, the secret alliance between a disgruntled governor and a foreign king, the planned surprise attack from beyond the frontier. To counter these invisible dangers, rulers relied on the most shadowy of all their architects, the spymaster. In a world where a single piece of timely information could mean the difference between dynasty and disaster, these masters of intelligence were the ultimate hidden guardians, the first and most critical line of defense. Their currency was not gold or grain, but secrets, and their networks of informants formed a nervous system that warned the brain of the empire of approaching danger long before it could be seen or felt. The sophistication of these ancient intelligence services can be startling. One of the earliest and most sophisticated was established by the Achaemenid Persian Empire, an entity so vast that controlling it required eyes and ears in every corner. The Persians developed a system centered around a royal official known as the King of Eyes or the King's Ear. This spymaster was responsible for a network of agents known as the eyes and ears of the king. The eyes were the imperial inspectors, traveling officials who would descend upon a province without warning to audit the satrap's governance, checking for corruption, disloyalty, or inefficiency. But the real secret weapon was the ears, a vast, anonymous army of informants embedded at every level of society, from the satrap's own court down to the markets and taverns of provincial towns. These individuals reported not only on the actions of officials but on the mood of the populace, the flow of seditious gossip, and any hint of unrest. The genius of this system was its psychological impact. A satrap governing a distant province knew that any act of treason or even gross incompetence could be reported back to the capital by someone he trusted implicitly, a servant, a soldier, even a close advisor. This created a powerful deterrent against rebellion, as the threat of discovery was constant and invisible. The Persian spy network was less about gathering information for a specific war and more about creating a pervasive atmosphere of surveillance that ensured loyalty across an empire of incredible diversity and scale. It was a tool of systemic control, making the distant authority of the King of Kings feel unnervingly present in the daily life of every official. Centuries later, the Byzantine Empire would refine the art of espionage to a science, particularly through its infamous secret service, which reported to the emperor alone. The Byzantines understood that information was a weapon to be used both defensively and offensively. Their agents, known as agents in rebus or later the more shadowy cubicularios, were masters of what we would now call active measures. They weren't just passive listeners, they were active manipulators. A Byzantine spymaster's toolkit included disinformation campaigns designed to sow discord among enemy tribes, bribery to turn key advisors in a rival court, and even assassination to remove a troublesome foreign leader. They operated under deep cover, sometimes for years, infiltrating the courts of enemies like the Sasanian Persians or the various Gothic kingdoms. The Byzantine Empire's longevity, surrounded by powerful and often hostile neighbors, is a testament to the effectiveness of this proactive intelligence apparatus. They believed the best way to win a war was to ensure it never started, or to so weaken the enemy from within that victory was a foregone conclusion. Their work was the ultimate expression of Sun Tzu's maxim that the supreme art of war is to subdue the enemy without fighting. The methods these spymasters employed were remarkably advanced. Cryptography, or secret writing, was a well-developed craft. A famous example comes from ancient Greece, where the Spartans used a device called a cytale for military communication. This was a wooden rod of a specific diameter around which a strip of parchment or leather was wrapped. A message was then written lengthwise along the rod. When unwound, the strip appeared to contain a jumble of meaningless letters. It could only be deciphered by wrapping it around a rod of exactly the same diameter, which would align the letters correctly. This simple tool ensured that if a messenger was captured, the message would be useless to the enemy without the key, the correctly sized rod. More complex ciphers involving letter substitutions and coded phrases were also used by spies sending reports back to their handlers. Beyond codes, the ancient spymaster was an expert in what we now call counterintelligence, the art of protecting one's own secrets. This involved everything from vetting personnel with access to sensitive information to running double agents who would feed false information to the enemy, leading them into carefully laid traps. The cat-and-mouse game of espionage, which seems so modern, was being played with high stakes in the courts and camps of the ancient world. Perhaps the most telling measure of a spymaster's success was its invisibility. A triumphant general would parade through the streets. A skilled diplomat would be celebrated for a peace treaty. But the spymaster's greatest achievement was a non-event, the rebellion that never happened because its ringleaders were quietly arrested weeks before, the surprise attack that failed because the defending general had been warned months in advance and had prepared a devastating counter-ambush. Their contributions are the most difficult for historians to trace because their work was designed to leave no trace. Success meant that the crisis they averted never entered the historical record in the first place. We only get glimpses of their world when their systems failed, when an assassination succeeded, or a coup caught the regime by surprise. The very silence of the sources on this topic is in itself a powerful testament to the effectiveness of these hidden architects. They operated in the spaces between the lines of history, their silent work ensuring the stability that allowed the empires they served to build, flourish, and leave behind the monuments and records we study today. Their legacy is the continuity they preserved, a continuity that now depended on the smooth and often treacherous operation of the imperial court itself. Picture the imperial court not as a place of serene order, but as a colossal and intricate machine, its gears constantly grinding against one another. This machine was fueled by ambition, jealousy, and the relentless pursuit of favor, and just like any complex mechanism, it required a master operator to prevent it from seizing up or tearing itself apart. This was the domain of the court manager, the chief administrator who served as the ultimate keeper of the household. While the emperor or pharaoh sat at the center of this universe as the sun, the court manager was the master of gravity, controlling the orbits of everyone around the throne. Their official title might have been Grand Chamberlain, Chief Eunuch, or Vizier, but their true function was universal. They were the gatekeepers. They decided which supplicant, which general, which minister would be granted a precious few minutes of the ruler's time. They controlled the royal schedule, the private treasury, and the army of servants, cooks, guards, and artisans that made the palace function. In their hands rested the delicate balance of access and exclusion, a power so profound it could shape the destiny of an empire without the court manager ever issuing a single public command. To understand the sheer scale of their responsibility, consider the Forbidden City in Beijing or the vast palace complexes of Persepolis. These were not just royal residences, they were small cities unto themselves, housing thousands of people. Managing this micro-society required the skills of a corporate executive, a logistics coordinator, and a political strategist all rolled into one. The court manager was responsible for the palace budget, ensuring there was enough gold to pay the staff, fund the endless rounds of banquets that were essential for diplomacy, and maintain the opulent surroundings that projected imperial power. They oversaw the procurement of everything from the finest silks for the emperor's robes to the daily food supply for the entire court. A single misstep, a poorly managed budget leading to unpaid guards, or a shortage of food causing discontent among the staff, could create vulnerabilities that enemies within the court would be quick to exploit. Their work was a constant test of administrative precision, where a mistake in accounting could be as dangerous as a mistake in battle. But the court manager's most potent weapon was their control over information. In an era before mass communication, the ruler was utterly dependent on the reports and messages that made it to his desk. The court manager acted as the primary filter for this flow of intelligence. A petition from a distant province about a famine could be placed on top of the pile or buried at the bottom. A general's urgent request for reinforcements could be delivered immediately, or it could be, accidentally, delayed until the military situation had become hopeless. By controlling who got to speak to the ruler and what documents he saw, the court manager could shape the monarch's perception of reality itself. They could make a minor official look like a rising star by ensuring his successful projects were praised, or they could orchestrate the downfall of a rival by selectively presenting evidence of his failures. This power made them the target of constant bribery and flattery from every other courtier, each desperate to influence the gatekeeper. The most successful court managers mastered the art of appearing indispensable while remaining seemingly self-effacing, a delicate dance that required immense political skill. This role often fell to a specific group of individuals, eunuchs. In many empires, particularly in China and the Byzantine Empire, eunuchs were deliberately chosen for these sensitive positions. Because they were castrated and could not father children who might establish a rival dynasty, they were perceived as being less of a threat to the ruling family. Their loyalty was thought to be solely to the emperor, not to any external clan or bloodline. This unique position allowed eunuchs in the later Han Dynasty of China to accumulate staggering power. They lived in the innermost sanctums of the palace, attending to the emperor's most private needs, and thus had constant, informal access to him. Over time, these eunuchs began to manipulate the flow of information, isolating emperors from the scholarly bureaucrats and military commanders. They formed powerful factions, amassed vast personal fortunes, and at times effectively became the real power behind the throne, making and unmaking emperors during periods of weak leadership. Their story is the most extreme example of the court manager's potential influence, demonstrating how control over the household could translate into control over the state itself. The court manager's expertise, however, went beyond mere administration and intrigue. It extended to a deep mastery of courtly etiquette, a complex and unspoken language of power. They were the arbiters of protocol, knowing precisely how deep a bow was required from a visiting ambassador, what gifts were appropriate for a royal birthday, and the exact order of precedence in a procession. These details were not trivial. They were a vital form of political communication. To be seated closer to the emperor at a banquet was a public sign of favor that could make or break a courtier's reputation. A slight, whether real or perceived, could be the opening salvo in a political war. The court manager was the stage director for this constant theater of power, ensuring that every gesture, every placement, every ritual reinforced the hierarchy and majesty of the throne. Theirs was a form of architecture built not of stone, but of ritual and routine, creating a daily performance of power that maintained the social order within the palace walls, an order that would face its ultimate test when the ruler passed away. Of all the threats an empire could face, invasion, famine, economic collapse, none was more predictable, yet more perilous than the death of its ruler. The moment a monarch drew their last breath, the entire political structure of the state entered a zone of extreme danger. The single greatest vulnerability of any hereditary system was the transfer of power, the delicate handoff from one generation to the next. While the emperor might project an image of timeless, god-like authority, the advisors in the shadows knew a brutal truth: dynasties are fragile things. Their most critical, ongoing mission was not just to serve the current ruler, but to engineer the survival of the regime itself by meticulously planning for its future. These succession planners were the ultimate strategic architects, playing a long game where the stakes were nothing less than the continuation of an entire civilization. Their work was a subtle art of manipulation, diplomacy, and sometimes outright deception, all aimed at convincing a diverse and often fractious empire that power was flowing smoothly along a predetermined, legitimate channel, even when the reality behind the scenes was anything but. This challenge was particularly acute in the Roman Empire, where the lack of a formal, clear-cut rule of succession created a recurring nightmare of instability. The Roman Principate was, in theory, not a monarchy but a complex fiction where the emperor was merely the first among equals. This ambiguity meant that when an emperor died, there was no automatic mechanism for choosing his successor. The result was often a bloody free-for-all. The infamous Year of the Four Emperors in 69 CE serves as a devastating case study. Following the death of Nero, the empire witnessed a rapid and brutal succession of Galba, Otho, Vitellius, and finally Vespasian, each rising to power through military support and civil war. The Roman legions, the ultimate power brokers, discovered they could make an emperor, and the empire was plunged into chaos as rival armies fought it out on Italian soil. This pattern repeated itself for centuries, a systemic flaw that drained the empire's treasury, weakened its frontiers, and cost countless lives. In this environment, the succession planner's role was not about following a neat legal formula. It was about building a coalition of support so powerful that it could overwhelm any potential rivals. This involved securing the loyalty of key military commanders, bribing or coercing influential senators, and most importantly, ensuring the current emperor publicly designated an heir apparent long before his death, lending the successor a cloak of legitimacy that was often the only thing standing between order and civil war. In stark contrast to Rome's often chaotic transitions, the early Ptolemaic dynasty in Egypt provides a masterclass in successful succession planning orchestrated by canny advisors. When Ptolemy I, a general of Alexander the Great, founded the dynasty, he and his counselors established a powerful new tool for securing the bloodline: royal sibling marriage. This practice, which seems shocking to modern sensibilities, was a calculated political strategy. By having the pharaoh marry his sister, the dynasty created a closed, divine bloodline that was impossible for outsiders to penetrate. It eliminated the danger of powerful noble families vying for influence by marrying their daughters into the royal house. The power and wealth remained within a single, self-perpetuating family unit. The advisors who championed this system understood that it provided unparalleled stability. It created a clear, unquestionable line of succession, as the children of such a union were seen as doubly divine, their right to rule inherent and uncontestable. For generations, this strategy worked remarkably well, allowing the Ptolemies to rule Egypt for nearly 300 years. The advisors who managed these successions, often senior court officials and the powerful priesthood of Alexandria, would orchestrate the elaborate coronation ceremonies that presented the new brother-sister ruling pair as living gods, ensuring a seamless transition of authority that the population accepted as part of the natural, divine order. One of the most precarious situations for any succession planner was the rise of a child emperor. A minor on the throne was an open invitation for power struggles, as various factions, the military, the bureaucracy, the imperial family vied to act as regent and control the state. The succession planner in this scenario had to become a masterful regent themselves, or carefully select one who would act in the dynasty's long-term interest rather than their own. A brilliant example of this, though it ultimately ended in tragedy, is the story of Tiberius and Gaius Gracchus's mother, Cornelia, in the Roman Republic. After the early death of her husband, Cornelia dedicated herself to the education and political advancement of her sons. She wasn't just raising children, she was grooming future leaders of the state, surrounding them with the finest Greek tutors and instilling in them a powerful sense of duty and popular appeal. Her meticulous planning nearly worked, propelling both sons to positions of great influence as tribunes of the plebs. While their radical reforms led to their deaths, Cornelia's role demonstrates the kind of long-term, intellectual preparation that defined successful succession planning, even in a non-monarchical system. In a more official capacity, regents like the Praetorian prefects in the later Roman Empire held the fate of the state in their hands. A regent who acted with wisdom and restraint, guiding the young emperor until he came of age and then gracefully returning power, was among the most valuable servants an empire could have. However, the temptation to cling to power was immense, and many a regent became the very threat they were supposed to prevent, either by eliminating the young ruler or by so alienating the court that the emperor's first act upon reaching maturity was to execute his former guardian. Beyond managing the immediate family, the succession planner's toolkit included a more diplomatic instrument: strategic marriage. Royal marriages were rarely about love. They were geopolitical tools designed to secure alliances, neutralize rivals, and integrate new territories. A well-arranged marriage could do the work of an army. The advisors who negotiated these unions were, in effect, conducting long-term foreign policy. By marrying a prince to a princess from a neighboring kingdom, they could transform a potential enemy into an in-law, creating a bond that would, in theory, ensure peace along a contested border for a generation. These marriages were also used internally to bind powerful, restless noble families to the ruling house. By offering a royal marriage to the daughter of a powerful duke or satrap, the crown could co-opt a potential rival, giving their family a vested interest in the success of the dynasty. The children of such marriages would carry the blood of both lines, further weaving the aristocracy into the imperial fabric. The succession planner had to be a keen student of human nature and politics, judging which alliances would be durable and which families were rising in influence and deserved to be brought into the fold. A single marriage contract drafted in a quiet chamber could secure the realm more effectively than a victory on the battlefield, proving that the pen, in the hands of a shrewd advisor, could indeed be mightier than the sword. Yet for all the roads, laws, and administrative systems an empire might build, its most resilient foundation was often something far less tangible, a shared sense of identity. Governing a vast collection of conquered peoples, each with their own gods, languages, and ancient traditions, presented a unique challenge. Military force could compel obedience, but it could not inspire loyalty. This is where the cultural architects entered the stage, the brilliant strategists who understood that true power lies in winning the hearts and minds of the populace. Their tool was not the legionary sword but the subtle art of assimilation and syncretism, the careful blending of cultures to create a new, overarching identity that could bind disparate peoples together under a single banner. These thinkers recognized that an empire held together only by fear was a brittle construct, perpetually on the verge of shattering. A stable empire, by contrast, made its subjects feel they had a stake in its success, that they were part of something larger than their local village or tribe. The cultural architect's mission was to design and propagate this unifying story. The Roman approach to this challenge was a masterclass in pragmatic flexibility. As Rome expanded from a city-state to a Mediterranean empire, its generals and governors encountered a dizzying array of local deities and religious practices. A lesser power might have tried to crush these foreign gods, provoking resentment and rebellion, but the cultural advisors to the Roman Senate and later the emperors proposed a far more ingenious strategy. They practiced a form of religious syncretism, systematically identifying Roman gods with their local counterparts. When Roman forces entered Greece, they didn't demand the worship of Jupiter. They simply declared that Jupiter was the same as the Greek Zeus. Similarly, the Roman goddess of love, Venus, was equated with the Greek Aphrodite. This was more than a semantic trick, it was a profound psychological maneuver. It allowed a conquered Greek citizen to continue worshipping their familiar gods while simultaneously acknowledging the authority of Rome. The local temple to Zeus could remain open, the priests could keep their positions, the festivals could continue. The only change was a subtle one. The supreme god was now also called Jupiter. This policy minimized cultural disruption and gave conquered elites a way to integrate into the Roman system without feeling they were betraying their heritage. The ultimate extension of this strategy was the imperial cult, the worship of the emperor's genius or divine spirit. This wasn't necessarily about believing the emperor was a god in a literal sense, but about creating a universal symbol of loyalty that transcended all local affiliations. Every subject from Britain to Syria could participate in this common ritual, reinforcing their connection to the central state. On the other side of the ancient world, the Achaemenid Persian Empire under rulers like Cyrus the Great and Darius I developed a different but equally sophisticated model of cultural architecture. Their empire was even more vast and diverse than Rome's, stretching from the Indus Valley to the Aegean Sea, encompassing Egyptians, Babylonians, Greeks, Jews, and dozens of other ethnic groups. The Persian solution was not to blend gods, but to champion a policy of calculated local autonomy within a unifying imperial framework. The famous Cyrus Cylinder, often called one of the first charters of human rights, illustrates this philosophy. After conquering Babylon, Cyrus did not impose Persian customs. Instead, he portrayed himself as a liberator, restoring displaced peoples to their homelands and allowing them to practice their own religions. He permitted the Jewish exiles in Babylon to return to Jerusalem and rebuild their temple, an act of religious tolerance that earned him praise in the Hebrew Bible. This was a brilliant political move. By respecting local traditions, Cyrus secured the loyalty of his new subjects at a minimal cost. But this respect for diversity was balanced by the introduction of key unifying elements. The Persians made Aramaic the official language of imperial administration across their entire domain. A merchant in Egypt sending a report to the capital or a tax collector in Anatolia recording receipts would do so in Aramaic. This created a common language of bureaucracy and commerce, facilitating trade and governance without forcing everyone to abandon their native tongue. Furthermore, the Persians built a network of royal roads and established a standardized imperial coinage, the daric. These tangible symbols of unity physically and economically connected the empire's far-flung provinces, making them feel part of a single, integrated system. The Persian cultural architects understood that unity did not require uniformity. The success of these strategies hinged on a deep understanding of human psychology. The cultural architects were, in effect, master storytellers. They crafted a narrative about the empire that emphasized its benefits, the peace, security, and economic opportunity that came from being part of a large, stable political unit. This narrative was then reinforced through every available channel coinage stamped with the emperor's image, public monuments celebrating imperial victories and virtues, and an education system for the children of local elites that taught them the language and values of the ruling power. The goal was to make the next generation identify more strongly with the empire than with the parochial traditions of their ancestors. A young man from Gaul who learned Latin, served in the Roman auxiliaries, and gained Roman citizenship would come to see himself as Roman. His loyalties would shift, and he would become an agent of further assimilation within his own community. This slow, deliberate process of cultural engineering was what transformed a mere territorial conquest into an enduring civilization. The work of these unseen thinkers demonstrates that the most powerful empires are not just built on armies and administration, but on a shared story that gives meaning and purpose to the millions who live within their borders. But the cultural unity fostered by shared languages and tolerant policies was only half the battle. To truly capture the hearts of a diverse population, an empire needed to speak to their emotions, their sense of wonder, and their deepest values. This is where the most visible and breathtaking architecture of power came into play, not the architecture of stone and road, but the architecture of image and story. Grand monuments, sweeping epic poems, and spectacular public games were far more than displays of wealth or artistic indulgence. In the hands of a cunning imperial advisor, they became a sophisticated patronage machine, a calculated investment in legitimacy designed to transmute raw power into something resembling love, loyalty, and awe. The advisors who managed this cultural engine understood a fundamental truth. To rule effectively, you must first command the imagination of your people. Consider the transformation of Rome under its first emperor, Augustus. After decades of brutal civil war that had shattered the old republic, Augustus faced the monumental task of healing deep social wounds and legitimizing his new, unprecedented position as sole ruler. Military victory had given him control, but it could not grant him lasting authority. For this, he turned to a close friend and advisor, Gaius Maximus. Maximus was not a general or a senator in the traditional sense. He was a cultural impresario, a patron of the arts with a keen political mind. His role was to bankroll and guide a generation of the most talented poets and writers, not for mere entertainment, but to craft a new founding myth for Rome. The most famous result of this patronage was Virgil's Aeneid. On the surface, it is an epic poem about the Trojan hero Aeneas's journey to Italy, but on a deeper political level, it is a masterpiece of propaganda. Virgil's work directly connects the founding of Rome to the heroic world of Troy, giving the Romans a glorious pedigree that rivaled that of the Greeks. More importantly, it weaves a narrative of divine destiny. suggesting that the entire history of Rome, culminating in the reign of Augustus, was part of a grand, preordained plan by the gods. Augustus himself is portrayed as the promised ruler who would usher in a new golden age of peace and prosperity. By embedding this message within a work of sublime literary art, Maximus and Virgil ensured it would be remembered, recited, and internalized by Romans for centuries. It wasn't a crude political pamphlet, it was a national epic that made the new regime feel inevitable and right. This literary campaign was complemented by a visual revolution orchestrated by Augustus's other advisors. Across the empire, a flood of statues, coins, and grand buildings presented a carefully curated image of the emperor. He was consistently depicted not as an arrogant conqueror, but as a mature, serious, and pious leader, a father to his people. This was a deliberate break from the realistic, sometimes unflattering portraits of the Republican era. Every coin that passed through a merchant's hand, every statue in a provincial forum, carried this message of stability and virtue. The construction projects were equally strategic. Augustus famously boasted that he had found Rome a city of brick and left it a city of marble. This was not an empty boast about aesthetics. It was a statement about permanence, order, and the tangible benefits of his rule. By building magnificent new forums, temples, and aqueducts, he was providing the people with stunning public works that improved their daily lives while simultaneously surrounding them with symbols of his power and benevolence. The message was clear: the chaos of the past is over, I have brought you peace, and this magnificent city is the proof. The Roman genius for this kind of spectacle reached its peak with the provision of bread and circuses, the famous phrase describing the state's distribution of free grain and the staging of vast public games. The advisors who managed the logistics of these games were masters of mass psychology. Events like chariot races at the Circus Maximus, which could hold 250,000 people, or gladiatorial contests in the Colosseum, were not mere diversions. They were carefully scripted rituals of power. The games always began with a grand procession, a pompa, that was deeply religious and political. The emperor would preside from his special box, the center of all attention. The crowd's cheers for their favorite teams or gladiators were also, indirectly, an acknowledgement of the patron who provided the spectacle. By giving the populace an outlet for their passions and a shared experience of excitement, the state channeled potential political discontent into harmless factional rivalries between the blue and green chariot teams. The games fostered a sense of communal Roman identity and served as a constant reminder of the emperor's generosity and his ability to command such wonders. A quiet, hungry city might plot rebellion, but a city entertained and fed was far more likely to remain loyal. This use of art and spectacle as a tool of control was a universal principle in the ancient world. In Persia, the immense palace complex at Persepolis was not just a royal residence. It was a deliberate stage for imperial propaganda. The magnificent reliefs on its stairways and walls did not depict bloody battles or the agonies of the defeated. Instead, they showed an endless, orderly procession of delegates from every corner of the empire, bringing tribute to the King of Kings. They are depicted not as conquered slaves, but as willing participants in a peaceful, prosperous, and divinely sanctioned global order. The message was one of inclusion and harmony under Persian authority. Similarly, the massive stone heads of the Olmec rulers in ancient Mesoamerica, carved from basalt and transported over vast distances, were more than portraits. They were monumental assertions of power and permanence, dominating the landscape and impressing upon all who saw them the unshakable authority of the ruler they represented. The advisors who commissioned these works understood that awe could be a more effective governor than fear. A subject who looks upon a towering statue or a magnificent temple and feels a sense of pride and wonder is a subject who has, to some degree, accepted the legitimacy of the power that built it. These patrons of the arts were, therefore, among the most subtle and effective of all the shadow architects. They built the empire's public face, crafting an appealing identity that could secure the loyalty of the masses long after the legions had moved on, ensuring the empire's influence would be felt even in the most remote and culturally distinct frontier regions. While the cultural architects in the capital were busy crafting a unifying identity, the ultimate test of that identity happened far away, in the dusty outposts and windswept forts that marked the empire's edge. The frontier was a world apart from the ordered heartland, a liminal space where imperial control was not a settled fact but a daily negotiation. Here, the empire confronted the unknown, the vast, unmapped territories, and the peoples it labeled as barbarians. Governing these volatile borderlands required a unique breed of administrator, one who combined the skills of a general, a diplomat, and a merchant. These frontier managers were the empire's shock absorbers, the men on the spot whose every decision could mean the difference between a profitable peace and a devastating war. They operated with a degree of autonomy unimaginable to officials in the capital, because a crisis on the border could not wait for a message to travel hundreds of miles and a reply to come back. Their judgment was the thin line that defined the empire's reality. The Roman approach to its frontiers, particularly in regions like Germany and Britain, offers a perfect case study in this specialized governance. The Roman limes was not simply a line on a map, it was a deep, integrated system of control. At its core were the legionary fortresses, massive permanent bases housing thousands of soldiers. But the true genius of the system lay in the network of smaller forts, watchtowers, and patrol roads that extended both forward and behind the main defensive line. The official in charge of this complex machine, often a legate or a governor, had to be a master of resource allocation. He decided where to build the next fort, which river crossing required a garrison, and how to rotate troops to keep them alert without exhausting them. But his role extended far beyond military deployment. The frontier was also an economic zone. The Romans established regulated markets near their forts where local tribes could trade goods. The frontier manager controlled these markets, setting the terms of trade. He could grant lucrative trading rights to friendly chieftains, fostering a dependent local elite that benefited from the Roman presence. Conversely, he could impose an embargo on a troublesome tribe, using economic pressure as a weapon far cheaper than sending in the legions. This official was constantly assessing the tribal politics beyond the border, playing one group against another to prevent a powerful, unified enemy from emerging. He was, in effect, conducting a continuous, low-level foreign policy, his decisions shaping the political landscape for hundreds of miles. A similar, yet culturally distinct, model of frontier management evolved along the greatest wall of all, the Chinese Great Wall. While we often picture it as a single, continuous stone barrier, it was really a vast, evolving system of walls, forts, and signal towers that represented a philosophical as well as a military approach to border control. For the Chinese empires, particularly the Han and the Ming, the wall was a statement of civilization itself, a demarcation between the orderly, agricultural world of the Middle Kingdom and the chaotic, nomadic steppes to the north. The official appointed to manage this frontier, often a high-ranking general or a specially appointed commissioner, bore a title that reflected his immense responsibility. He was the protector of the borders. His duties were multifaceted. Militarily, he had to guard against raids from nomadic confederations like the Xiongnu or later the Mongols, forces that could strike with lightning speed and then vanish back into the grasslands. This required a deep understanding of nomadic tactics and a system of early warning using beacon towers that could relay messages across vast distances in a matter of hours. But the Chinese frontier manager was also a key player in the tributary system, a sophisticated diplomatic framework that defined China's relationship with the outside world. Nomadic leaders were encouraged to travel to the Chinese capital, acknowledge the emperor's superiority, and present gifts. In return, they would receive valuable trade goods, official titles, and sometimes even a Chinese princess in marriage. The frontier official was the gatekeeper of this system. He would receive these delegations at the wall, assess their intentions, and provide them with escorts to the interior. His report on the attitude and strength of a nomadic leader could determine whether the court in Beijing offered generous terms or a stern warning. He understood that a well-managed tributary relationship could secure the border for a generation, turning a potential enemy into a client state. The wall, therefore, was not just a barrier, it was a controlled gateway, a place where the empire could manage its interactions with the outside world on its own terms. The official who governed it had to know when to shut the gate and man the battlements, and when to open it for the carefully choreographed rituals of diplomacy and trade that kept the peace. The life of a frontier manager was a constant balancing act between the carrot and the stick. A governor who was too aggressive, too quick to use military force, could provoke a major war that the empire could ill afford. Yet, a governor who was perceived as weak would invite constant raiding and lose the respect of both the local tribes and his own troops. The most successful ones mastered the art of calibrated force. They might punish a small-scale raid with a swift, devastating retaliatory strike against the specific village responsible, demonstrating resolve without engaging in a wider conflict. But they would also be the first to offer terms after demonstrating that strength, knowing that a humiliated enemy would only seek revenge. They lived in a world of intelligence gathered from scouts, traders, and even turncoats from the other side. Their most valuable asset was not necessarily the number of legions at their command, but the quality of their information about the mood, alliances, and internal disputes of the tribes beyond the border. A smart frontier manager could foment a succession dispute within a nomadic confederation, preoccupying them with internal strife and rendering them harmless for years. Ultimately, the work of these officials defined the very nature of the empire they served. A frontier that was a zone of constant, low-level conflict drained the imperial treasury and militarized the state. But a frontier that functioned as a vibrant zone of controlled exchange could be a source of great wealth and cultural vitality. The Silk Road, for instance, was not a spontaneous phenomenon. It was made possible by the security and infrastructure provided by the frontier administrations of empires like Han China and Rome. The caravan cities that thrived along these routes, such as Palmyra in the Syrian desert, were testament to the success of frontier managers in creating islands of stability where commerce could flourish. These officials were the unsung architects of globalization, their policies determining whether ideas, goods, and people moved across borders freely or were met with a wall of spears. Their daily decisions, made in remote outposts far from the glory of the capital, quietly shaped whether the empire would be an open, connected network or a closed, fortified fortress. History, with its grand narratives of rise and fall, can sometimes give the impression that an empire's collapse is a single, catastrophic event, but the reality is far more nuanced. For every empire that vanished, there were countless moments where it teetered on the brink, only to be pulled back from the edge by the decisive actions of a few clear-minded individuals. When the normal rhythms of statecraft shattered under the weight of famine, plague, or invasion, the spotlight shifted from the visionary planners to the ultimate first responders, the crisis managers. These were the advisors and officials whose genius was not in building for the long term, but in improvising solutions for an immediate existential threat. Theirs was a different kind of architecture, not the careful laying of a foundation, but the frantic shoring up of a collapsing wall, using whatever materials were at hand. In these moments of extreme peril, their cool-headedness and strategic ingenuity often meant the difference between a temporary setback and the final, irreversible end. To understand the sheer scale of the challenge these individuals faced, we need only look at the Roman Empire during the disastrous period known as the Crisis of the 3rd century. For roughly 50 years, the empire seemed to be in a death spiral. The throne became a prize for the strongest general, changing hands with brutal frequency through assassination and civil war. At one point, the empire splintered into 3 separate, competing states. Meanwhile, devastating plagues swept through the population. Barbarian invasions pierced deep into imperial territory, and the economy hyperinflated into worthlessness. The very idea of a unified Rome was close to evaporating. Yet the empire survived. This survival was not a matter of luck. It was the achievement of a series of soldier emperors like Aurelian, but more importantly, of the unsung administrators who implemented the drastic reforms that staunched the bleeding. Their work was a masterclass in emergency triage for a state. On the military front, they recognized that the old legionary system was too slow and unwieldy to respond to multiple, simultaneous threats. The solution was to create a new, highly mobile central reserve force, the comitatenses, that could be rushed to any crisis point. This required a complete overhaul of recruitment, training, and deployment, a logistical nightmare executed under the pressure of constant warfare. Even more critical was the economic crisis. The Roman currency, the denarius, had been so debased, its silver content reduced to almost nothing, that it was essentially worthless. Barter returned, and the state's ability to pay its soldiers and officials collapsed. The crisis managers of the late 3rd and early 4th centuries, particularly under Emperor Diocletian, responded with a set of bold, if heavy-handed, interventions that would seem radical in any era. Diocletian's edict on maximum prices was an attempt to use imperial fiat to control hyperinflation, setting price caps on thousands of goods and services across the empire. While ultimately unenforceable, it reveals the sheer desperation and the scale of the thinking required. More successfully, he overhauled the tax system, moving away from the unreliable currency to a system based on actual goods and labor, the annona militaris. This meant the state could directly feed and supply its armies, bypassing the broken monetary system entirely. These reforms were not elegant. They created a more rigid, authoritarian, and bureaucratic state. But they worked. They restored a basic level of functionality that allowed the empire to reconquer its breakaway provinces and survive for another century and a half in the west and for 1,000 more years in the east. The advisors who designed and implemented these measures were not building for a glorious future. They were making painful, pragmatic choices to ensure there would be a future at all. The Eastern Roman, or Byzantine, Empire provides another stunning example of crisis management under the most dire circumstances imaginable, a siege that threatened to erase the empire from the map. In the year 1453, the young Sultan Mehmed II laid siege to Constantinople with an enormous army and massive cannons capable of breaching the city's legendary walls. The Byzantine Empire at this point was a shadow of its former self, little more than the city itself and a few scattered territories. The Emperor Constantine XI faced what seemed like certain defeat. Yet the city held out for nearly 2 months, a testament to the defensive preparations orchestrated by a handful of key figures. One of the most crucial was a European engineer and artillery expert named Johannes Grant. While the Genos general Giovanni Giustiniani is often credited with leading the land defense, it was Grant's technical expertise that proved vital. He directed the complex work of repairing the massive walls almost as quickly as the Ottoman cannons could damage them. He also orchestrated counter-mining operations, digging tunnels to intercept and destroy the tunnels the Ottomans were digging to mine beneath the fortifications. This underground war was a desperate, claustrophobic battle of wits and courage, and Grant's cool leadership in these hellish conditions extended the siege far beyond what the attackers had anticipated. Beyond the walls, the crisis managers were also working the diplomatic front until the very end. The Byzantine emperor and his advisors sent frantic appeals for help to the Christian powers of Europe. While a major relief force never materialized, their efforts did secure the assistance of the Genos Condottiero Giustiniani and his 700 professional soldiers, who proved instrumental in organizing the defense. This highlights another key aspect of crisis management: the ability to secure allies and resources from outside the collapsing system. Every ship that slipped through the Ottoman blockade with supplies, every foreign fighter who joined the defense, was a small victory for the Byzantine strategists. Ultimately, Constantinople fell, but the prolonged and ferocious defense engineered by these last-minute architects of survival had profound consequences. It allowed time for Greek scholars and ancient texts to be evacuated to Italy, helping to fuel the Renaissance. It forced Mehmed to expend vast resources, shaping his subsequent policies. The fall was not a sudden collapse but a negotiated, protracted struggle, precisely because crisis managers within the city maximized every possible advantage, turning a certain quick defeat into a legendary last stand. Their legacy is a reminder that even in the face of inevitable collapse, the actions of determined individuals can shape the aftermath and preserve fragments of a civilization for the future. The true measure of a crisis manager's skill, however, lies not just in the grand, dramatic sieges or systemic overhauls, but in the ability to manage multiple, cascading failures. A single threat, like an invasion, was bad enough, but what happened when that invasion was accompanied by a crop failure, which in turn sparked a rebellion in a distant province? This domino effect was the nightmare scenario, and it required a holistic understanding of the empire's interconnected systems. An effective response couldn't just focus on the army. It had to address the food supply to calm the populace, offer amnesties or concessions to quell rebellion, and perhaps even launch a propaganda campaign to maintain morale. The crisis manager had to be a juggler, keeping several balls in the air at once, knowing that dropping any one of them could lead to total catastrophe. This required a mind capable of seeing the entire chessboard, understanding how a move in one area would create ripple effects in another. Their success was the empire's resilience, a quality that was not inherent but was carefully, and often painfully, cultivated through each survived disaster. The lessons learned from one crisis became the institutional knowledge that helped weather the next, a hidden inheritance of survival strategies passed down through generations of administrators who understood that the price of empire was eternal vigilance. But to truly grasp the full scope of how empires were built, we must turn our attention to a group whose contributions have been doubly obscured by the passage of time: the women who operated in the shadows of power. While the names of kings and generals dominate the historical record, a parallel network of female influence often functioned as the true stabilizing force behind the throne. Their authority was rarely declared in public edicts or celebrated in triumphal arches. Instead, it was woven into the very fabric of court life, exercised through the intimate channels of advice, motherhood, and strategic marriage. These women mastered the art of power without the official title, navigating a world that celebrated male authority while quietly building empires of their own through influence and intelligence. Consider the formidable Empress Lü of the Han Dynasty in China. Following the death of her husband, Emperor Gaozu, she did not merely retire to the background as a silent widow. Instead, she seized control as regent for her young son, and later her grandson, effectively ruling the Han Empire for a period of 15 years. This was no mere caretaker administration. Empress Lü proved to be a shrewd and ruthless political operator. She systematically promoted members of her own Lü clan to key government positions, sidelining potential rivals from the imperial Lü family to consolidate her grip on power. She successfully navigated a tense peace with the powerful Qiongnu Confederation to the north, avoiding a costly war through a combination of diplomatic finesse and a show of strength. Under her regency, the dynasty stabilized and continued to prosper, following the administrative blueprints of her husband, but enforcing them with her own iron will. Her story is a powerful testament to how the role of regent, often a temporary and theoretically passive position, could be transformed into a platform for sustained, effective rule. She was every bit the architect of the early Han state, yet traditional histories often frame her as a scheming usurper, a clear example of how female power was vilified when it stepped outside prescribed boundaries. In ancient Egypt, we see a different model of female influence, one that operated in full partnership with a ruling queen. While Pharaoh Hatshepsut is rightly celebrated for her prosperous reign, the stability of her rule was bolstered by the crucial role played by her daughter, Neferure. In a society where the royal family was the central institution of the state, Neferure was not simply a princess waiting for a marriage alliance. Her mother appointed her to the powerful and traditionally male title of God's wife of Ammon, a priesthood that controlled vast temple estates and wielded significant economic and religious influence. This was a strategic masterstroke. By placing her daughter in this role, Hatshepsut created a powerful ally within the influential priestly class, ensuring their support for her unconventional rule as a female king. Neferure also appears to have acted as a stand-in for the pharaoh at important religious ceremonies and may have managed aspects of the royal household. Her presence provided a layer of legitimacy and continuity, reinforcing the divine nature of her mother's kingship. Neferure's story illustrates that female power was not always a solo endeavor. It could be a collaborative project between mothers and daughters, a behind-the-scenes partnership that ensured the smooth functioning of the state. The most common and often most effective form of female power was the influence wielded from the domestic sphere. As the wives, mothers, and chief confidants of emperors, these women had unparalleled access to the ruler at his most unguarded moments. They could shape policy through private conversation, advocate for or against certain advisors, and use their knowledge of the ruler's personality to gently steer decisions in a particular direction. The Roman Empress Livia Drusilla, wife of Augustus, perfected this art. While Augustus presented himself as the restorer of traditional Roman family values, Livia was his most trusted partner in governance. She managed his personal correspondence, advised him on political appointments, and acted as a patron to a network of clients who owed their positions to her favor. Her influence was so well known that poets like Ovid appealed to her directly for help in ending their exile. Livia's power was subtle, exercised through suggestion and patronage rather than command, yet it was a constant and vital force throughout Augustus's long reign. She understood that the bedroom and the dining room could be as important as the Senate chamber in the governance of Rome. This informal power, however, created a paradox. Because it was exercised outside the official structures of government, it was incredibly difficult for contemporary historians, who were almost exclusively male and focused on public life to document with any fairness. A woman who offered wise counsel was a virtuous helper. A woman who was perceived as manipulating a weak emperor was a sinister schemer, a power behind the throne in the most negative sense. This bias has colored the historical portrayal of countless influential women, from the Byzantine Empress Theodora to the Mughal Empress Nur Jahan. Their ambitious and politically astute actions were often reinterpreted through a lens of personal greed or sexual manipulation, obscuring the genuine administrative skill and strategic vision they possessed. The very channels they used to exert influence, the private audience, the family connection, made their contributions easy to dismiss or demonize, ensuring their roles as true architects of empire would remain in the shadows for centuries. Recognizing their indispensable work is not just about adding women to the historical narrative. It is about completing our understanding of the complex, collaborative, and often deeply personal machinery that actually made ancient empires function. So we have journeyed through the lives of these incredible minds, these master planners and logistical wizards who built the very foundations of the ancient world. We have uncovered their stories, marveled at their ingenuity, and recognized their indispensable contributions. And this leads us to perhaps the most perplexing question of all. If these individuals were so vital, why are their names not etched alongside the Caesars and Alexanders in our collective memory? Why did a cloak of systemic anonymity fall over them? The answer is not a simple one. It is a complex tapestry woven from the threads of history, culture, and human psychology itself. First and foremost, we must confront the uncomfortable truth that history is not a neutral record of events. It is a narrative, and narratives are almost always shaped by the victors, by those who hold the power to tell the story. The rulers on the throne had a profound vested interest in being seen as the sole, heroic architects of their empire's glory. To share the spotlight with a brilliant but low-born engineer or a shrewd eunuch advisor would have risked undermining the carefully crafted image of the monarch as a divinely chosen, omnipotent leader. Imagine the court historians whose livelihoods depended on the favor of the king. Their primary task was to compose epic poems and chronicles that glorified their patron, attributing every success to his wisdom, courage, and direct command. A victory on the battlefield was recorded as the general's triumph, even if the victory was only possible because of the anonymous logistician who ensured the army was fed and equipped. This was not necessarily a malicious act of erasure. It was simply the way power perpetuated itself. The story of the state was the story of the ruler, and all other characters were supporting actors, their lines often cut from the final script to highlight the star. Beyond this political framing, there is a deeper cultural reason. Our modern obsession with individual genius and personal authorship is just that, a modern obsession. In many ancient societies, the concept of the individual creator was far less pronounced than the idea of collective or patron-driven achievement. Great works were often attributed to the ruler who commissioned them or to the collective effort of the people. When an Egyptian pharaoh erected a magnificent temple, the inscriptions credited him, not the master architect who drew the plans or the chief sculptor who carved the hieroglyphs. The architect was seen as an instrument of the pharaoh's divine will. In the same way, a legal code was the law of Hammurabi, not the law of the committee of jurists who drafted it. This cultural lens saw achievement as a reflection of the patron's power and virtue. The individuals who did the actual work were part of a larger, impersonal system, their personal identities submerged within the glory of the state or the deity they served. Their reward was in the successful completion of the task, not in personal fame. Then there is the inherent nature of the work itself. let's be honest, administration is not glamorous. The painstaking work of designing a tax code, managing a grain supply ledger, or drafting a trade regulation lacks the dramatic, cinematic quality of a cavalry charge or a speech before the Senate. Military conquest provides clear, visceral moments of triumph: the storming of a wall, the surrender of a king, the parade of captives. These are the events that make for compelling history books and epic poetry. But the slow, steady, unglamorous work of building the systems that prevent a conquest from immediately collapsing into chaos, that is a story of ledgers and logistics, of patience and procedure. It is the difference between the dramatic explosion that starts an engine and the silent, continuous turning of the gears that keeps it running. Human attention is naturally drawn to the explosion. We celebrate the general who wins the war, not the quartermaster who won the war of supply. The very success of the shadow architect was measured in stability and continuity, achievements that are, by their nature, invisible. A crisis averted leaves no monument. This leads to a powerful psychological bias. We are storytellers by nature, and we crave simple, clean narratives with a clear protagonist. The great man theory of history, the idea that a single, towering figure can shape the course of events through sheer force of will, is a deeply satisfying and intuitive concept. It is far easier to picture Alexander the Great single-handedly conquering the known world than it is to comprehend the vast, collaborative machine of diplomats, engineers, and officials that made each step of his campaign possible. Attributing monumental achievements to a lone genius simplifies a complex, messy reality. It allows us to package history into digestible legends. The shadow architect disrupts this comfortable narrative. They force us to acknowledge that civilization is a team sport, a symphony of countless specialized talents working in concert. Accepting this complexity requires a more nuanced and perhaps less romantically satisfying view of how the world actually works. Finally, we must consider the practical matter of the historical record. The work of the spymaster, the court manager, and the diplomatic negotiator was, by its very definition, meant to be secret. Their greatest successes were the conspiracies that never hatched, the wars that never started, the scandals that were quietly contained. These victories leave no paper trail. They are gaps in the archive, silent testaments to their effectiveness. Furthermore, the primary documents that do survive, the clay tablets, the papyrus scrolls, the stone inscriptions, were overwhelmingly produced by and for the elite. They record royal decrees, military victories, and temple donations. The day-to-day administrative memos, the drafts of legal codes, the field reports from engineers, these were written on more perishable materials and were rarely considered important enough to preserve for eternity. The voices of the shadow architects were often silenced not by conspiracy, but by the simple, accidental bias of what gets saved and what turns to dust over the centuries. We are left with the loud, monumental voice of power, while the quiet, practical whispers of those who maintained that power have faded to near inaudibility. This collective forgetting has profoundly shaped our understanding, creating an illusion of solitary genius that this entire exploration seeks to dismantle. So how do we, centuries or even millennia later, pull these figures back from the shadows? How do we reconstruct the lives of individuals whose very existence was designed to be unobtrusive? The answer lies in a modern-day detective story, one that combines the traditional skills of the historian with the cutting-edge tools of the scientist. We are no longer solely reliant on the boastful inscriptions of kings. Instead, we have learned to read the ancient world in a new way, deciphering the faint whispers left behind in the dust of archives, the chemistry of pottery, and even the mathematical patterns of social networks. The recovery of the shadow architect is a multidisciplinary triumph, a painstaking process of connecting dots that were never meant to be connected. One of the most direct methods is quite literally to read their mail. While kings were busy erecting monuments to their own glory, the day-to-day business of running an empire generated an immense paper trail, or more accurately, a clay trail. The administrative archives of ancient Mesopotamia, particularly from cities like Mari on the Euphrates, are a treasure trove for this kind of investigation. These are not epic poems, they are the boring stuff of governance, inventories of grain shipments, reports from provincial governors, diplomatic correspondence between mid-level officials, and memos about repairing canals. It is in these thousands of baked clay tablets that we find the true heartbeat of the empire. A single tablet might record the disbursement of bronze tools to a team of workers, signed by a scribe named Nur-Sin. Another might be a letter from an official named Zimri Lim, reporting on the mood of a neighboring kingdom. By cross-referencing these names across hundreds of documents, historians can start to build a profile. They can see Nur-Sin's career progress over 20 years, from a junior scribe to a supervisor of major construction projects. They can map Zimri Lim's diplomatic missions, understanding his network of contacts and the specific expertise that made him indispensable to the king. These archives transform anonymous bureaucrats into three-dimensional people with careers, responsibilities, and relationships. They reveal the vast, layered bureaucracy that functioned below the radar of the royal annals, giving us the organizational charts of ancient power. When written documents are scarce, we turn to the stones that mark their final resting places. Tomb inscriptions and reliefs can be remarkably revealing, especially for officials who are granted the honor of burial near their pharaoh. The tomb of a high official in ancient Egypt was his curriculum vitae carved in stone. The walls are covered with lists of his titles: an overseer of the royal granaries, chief treasurer, vizier of the king. These are not just empty honors, they are a precise map of his administrative portfolio, a relief showing the tomb owner overseeing the census of cattle or the collection of taxes from Nubian chieftains provides a visual record of his duties. Sometimes these inscriptions boast of the official's humble origins, stating that he was raised up by the king based solely on his merit. This is a powerful clue, suggesting a ruler who actively sought out talented administrators regardless of their birth, a practice that would explain the rise of many a shadow architect. Even the location and size of the tomb relative to the royal pyramid speaks volumes about the individual's importance and proximity to the source of power. By carefully piecing together these titulary clues and iconographic scenes, Egyptologists can reconstruct an official's career path and understand the specific systems he managed, moving him from a name on a wall to a key administrator in the state's machinery. In the last few decades, a revolutionary new tool has entered the historian's toolkit: network theory. This approach uses the power of data and computing to map the complex web of relationships that constituted a royal court or a government bureaucracy. The idea is simple but profound. Power is not just about individual status, but about one's position within a network. Historians can input data from thousands of documents: who wrote to whom, who witnessed which treaty, who was related to whom by marriage or patronage. The software then generates a visual map of the social and political landscape. On this map, the king will naturally be a major node with many connections. But network analysis can reveal other, surprisingly well-connected figures who might not have held the most glamorous public titles. Perhaps it's the royal scribe who appears as a witness on every important document, indicating his trusted presence at the heart of all decision-making. Or it might be a queen mother who, the data shows, was the common link between several powerful factions at court. This method allows us to identify the influencers, the gatekeepers, and the central connectors, the very individuals who operated as the hidden architecture of the state. It provides quantitative evidence for what was once only a qualitative hunch, revealing the shadowy pillars that supported the throne. Perhaps the most dramatic advances have come from the hard sciences. Archaeologists are now less like treasure hunters and more like forensic investigators. Take residue analysis, for example. For centuries, a large clay jar found in a palace storeroom was just a pot. Today, a chemist can take a tiny sample from its fabric and detect microscopic traces of the substances it once held: wine, olive oil, honey, or even faint chemical signatures of specific spices. When this is done on a massive scale across an entire storage complex, it stops being about a single jar and starts being about economic policy. The pattern of residues can reveal a centralized system of collection and redistribution. It can show that grain was being gathered from distant villages, stored in central silos, and then distributed as rations to workers or soldiers. This is direct, physical evidence of the logistical planning we discussed earlier, proof of an administrative mind at work organizing the economy. It allows us to see the scale of the operation and infer the existence of the planners who designed it, even if their names are forever lost. Similarly, the analysis of skeletal remains can tell a startling story. By examining the isotopes in the teeth of individuals buried in a capital city, scientists can determine where they grew up. It is not uncommon to find that a significant portion of a city's elite were not locals. They were brought from conquered territories or allied states for their specific skills. The discovery of an official in the court of the pharaoh who spent his childhood in the Levant suggests a deliberate policy of co-opting foreign talent, a brain drain orchestrated by a ruler to strengthen his own administration. Even the layout of a city is a text to be read. The deliberate, grid-like plan of Mohenjo-Daro in the Indus Valley or the standardized design of Roman military forts across Europe are not accidental. They are the physical manifestation of a central planning authority, a blueprint for order imposed upon the landscape. The city itself becomes a monument to its unknown designer. Every fragment of evidence, from the chemical signature in a pot to the mathematical precision of a street plan, is a piece of the puzzle. By combining the meticulous reading of texts with the analytical power of science and data, we are finally able to trace the outlines of the ghosts in the machine, giving voice to the silent partners who built the world of antiquity. The stories of these ancient architects are not just dusty relics of the past. They are a powerful mirror reflecting the very structure of our modern world. We may have traded clay tablets for cloud servers and royal decrees for corporate memos, but the fundamental principles of how large-scale achievements actually happen remain strikingly unchanged. The timeless lesson from the shadows is this: behind every celebrated breakthrough, every powerful institution, and every world-changing innovation, there is an indispensable ecosystem of unseen specialists making it all possible. Our ancient predecessors understood that an empire was a collaborative project, a symphony of talent where the conductor, while vital, was powerless without the entire orchestra. Today, we often fall into the trap of the lone genius myth, celebrating the visionary CEO or the charismatic political leader, while overlooking the intricate support systems that translate their vision into reality. The true legacy of the Imhoteps and the anonymous Persian satrap designers is a profound reminder to value the builders over the talkers, the architects of systems over the architects of image. Consider the modern equivalents of these ancient roles. The policy advisor drafting legislation in a government office today is the direct descendant of the jurists who crafted Hammurabi's Code or Justinian's Corpus Juris Civilis. Their work is equally meticulous, equally unglamorous, and equally foundational to the functioning of society. They take a political goal improving healthcare, reforming education, addressing climate change, and engineer the complex legal and regulatory framework that makes it implementable. They anticipate unintended consequences, negotiate with stakeholders, and draft the precise language that will affect millions of lives. Yet, when a bill is signed into law, the media focuses on the politician holding the pen, not the team of lawyers and analysts who spent countless sleepless nights ensuring that pen had something meaningful to sign. Their success, like that of their ancient counterparts, is measured in the stability and fairness of the system they create, not in personal fame. In the corporate world, the software engineers who build and maintain the digital infrastructure of a company like Amazon or Google are the contemporary equivalents of the Roman road engineers and the Persian Qanat builders. Their code is the invisible roadway upon which global commerce and communication now travel. They design the algorithms that manage unimaginably complex logistics networks, ensuring a package moves from a warehouse to a doorstep with breathtaking efficiency. They build the data centers that function like the granaries of old, storing and processing the information that is the lifeblood of the modern economy. When we stream a movie or order groceries online, we experience the end result of their work, a seamless, reliable service, but we rarely, if ever, see the teams of engineers troubleshooting servers, patching security vulnerabilities, and optimizing code to prevent the entire system from grinding to a halt. Their genius is in creating an infrastructure so robust that it becomes invisible, taken for granted until it fails, much like the citizens of Rome took their aqueducts for granted. This perspective is crucial for tackling the monumental challenges of the 21st century. Problems like global pandemics, climate change, and international cybersecurity threats are too vast and interconnected to be solved by any single leader or nation acting alone. They require the same kind of collaborative, systemic thinking that the ancient shadow architects mastered. The successful response to a pandemic, for instance, is not just about a president giving a speech. It is a colossal logistical and administrative operation. It involves the virologists, the intellectual strategists developing vaccines, the public health officials, the administrators designing rollout plans, the truck drivers and warehouse managers, the logisticians distributing doses, and the local nurses, the frontier managers administering them. This entire chain is held together by the quiet, coordinated effort of thousands of professionals, each an expert in their niche, much like the teams that supplied a Roman legion on the march. To believe that any one person at the top is solely responsible for the outcome is to misunderstand the nature of the problem completely. Ultimately, the greatest lesson from the shadows is a humbling and empowering one about the nature of success itself. It challenges our culture's obsession with individual celebrity and redirects our admiration toward the power of the team, the system, and the process. The next time you witness a great achievement, whether it's a successful space mission or the launch of a transformative product, try to look past the figurehead on the stage. Consider the project managers who kept the timeline on track, the quality assurance testers who hunted for bugs, the accountants who managed the budget, and the support staff who kept the office running. These individuals are the modern-day Imhoteps, weaving their expertise into the fabric of a larger goal. By recognizing and valuing this collaborative reality, we foster a culture that is more resilient, more innovative, and better equipped to build a future that, like the greatest ancient empires, is designed to last. It is a shift in perspective that values the deep, structural integrity of an organization over the fleeting glow of a single spotlight. We began by questioning the solitary figure on the throne, and we end with a profound appreciation for the collective genius that truly built the ancient world. The journey we have taken together has been a deliberate shift in focus, pulling back the camera from the spotlight on a single ruler to reveal the bustling, brilliant workshop of minds operating just outside its glare. The architects of empire, the administrators who designed the tax codes, the engineers who charted the aqueducts, the diplomats who wove alliances, and the strategists who planned campaigns far from the battlefield were not merely supporting characters. They were the indispensable foundation upon which all glory rested, the silent partners in every celebrated triumph. Their stories collectively teach us a powerful and humbling lesson about history itself. It is not a solo performance but a collaborative project of staggering complexity. The most enduring impact, the kind that builds civilizations that last for centuries, most often comes from the quiet, dedicated work of building systems rather than from the loud, fleeting thrill of conquest. As we look upon the ruins of great civilizations, the weathered stones of a Roman aqueduct, the silent steps of a Mesopotamian ziggurat, the fragmented phrases of a legal code, let us train our minds to see more than the fingerprints of kings. Let us remember the unseen minds who drew the blueprints, who calculated the stresses and strains, who drafted the clauses that brought order from chaos. These individuals understood that real power is not about a moment of victory, but about constructing a reality that can sustain itself long after the victor's parade has faded from memory. They built the world we have inherited, piece by thoughtful piece. If this exploration has reshaped your view of history, if it has made you curious about the hidden machinery behind the grand narratives, we would love to hear from you. Share your thoughts in the comments below about which unsung architect you find most fascinating. Was it the logistical genius who fed 1 million people in Rome, or the legal mind whose work echoes in courtrooms today? Let us know and subscribe for more journeys into the shadows of the past, where the true builders of our world are waiting to be discovered.